On that enchanting evening, when stately aristocrats glided leisurely through the illuminated ballroom, the soft reflections of the candelabra danced on the marble floor, emphasizing the luxury and graceful splendor of the unforgettable celebration that was taking place. A lady with pink curls, dressed in a light dress shimmering with mother of pearl, stood by a marble column, twirling her fan and listening to the whispered gossip. The young viscountess had taken a secret lover, which was why her husband's family could barely contain their indignation. Young daughters of noble families, shining in silk, whispered that it was difficult to look impeccable every evening. Corsets constricted their breathing, jewelry pulled at their shoulders. Matrons found fault with trifles, and finding a husband who valued the soul, not the title, seemed unattainable. And suddenly, like a gust of wind, a barely perceptible rustle behind her attracted the attention of one of the ladies, whose chestnut curls framed a face with blue eyes. Feeling a strange premonition, she smoothly turned around, as if expecting to see something fateful. Only Her Highness Lefurion maintained a majestic silence, standing at a distance from the talkative crowd, not engaging in conversations or making reproaches towards her husband. She calmly sipped champagne, gracefully holding an elegant crystal glass in her slender fingers. Despite the even and almost serene expression on her face, the girl was well aware that Gloria and Circia were partly right. There really was an icy tone in her husband's voice, and, oddly enough, it hurt, but she believed that not everything was so bad. The society ladies, dressed in shiny silks, cast furtive, curious glances in Lefurion's direction, pursing their lips in displeased grimaces, as if hoping to catch snippets of her revelations in order to add a new piquant detail to the gossip treasury. Lefurion was about to turn around to interrupt the flow of growing thoughts and leave the room, when suddenly a man's hand unexpectedly appeared behind her, reaching out to her with ease, and confident fingers gently touched her waist through the thin fabric of her dress. It was her husband who came up quietly, soundlessly, like a shadow, embraced her with a gentle, almost enveloping gesture, pressed her to himself, not hiding his tenderness, and his black hair, combed neatly back, shone in the light of the chandeliers, and his scarlet eyes shone with a lively smile. This man, whose title sounded majestic, Archduke Turdeo Dene Lefurion, was the embodiment of nobility and refinement, and his smile, bright and sincere, as if illuminating the world, made him truly beautiful in the eyes of others. Continuing to tenderly embrace his wife, not paying the slightest attention to her shyness, slight blush, or timid resistance, he suddenly quietly said that he had been looking for her for a long time and felt truly happy that he had finally found her. The lady suddenly, but with the grace inherent in her position and aristocratic upbringing, resolutely pressed her palm against her husband's face, as if trying to push him away from her, while whispering slightly embarrassedly that they were in public, and he should behave more restrainedly and more carefully. Before the Archduke had time to react or even understand what had caused her such a sudden reaction, a young boy with a worried face and disheveled hair ran up to them, loudly shouting towards his father to let his mother go, because everyone could see how awkward and tense his beloved mother felt. Almost immediately, decisive steps on elegant heels were heard across the marble floor, decorated with intricate patterns, and a tall, stately aristocrat in a luxurious crimson dress approached the assembled group, confidently confirming the boy's rightness, drawing attention to the inappropriateness of such a stormy and demonstrative display of feelings. This lady, beautiful and expressive, with long, bright red hair, decorated with pearls, and sparkling eyes of the same fiery hue, was none other than the Duchess's sister-in-law, and her name was Circia Jane Lefurion, a woman with a strong character, a sharp mind. And the boy who defended his mother with such fervor was called Selfius Sultan Lefurion. He was the son of a ducal couple, and, crossing his arms over his chest with almost comical determination, he stood, looking from under his brows like an adult, expressing complete disagreement with what was happening. Mrs. Circia, hearing his loud voice, suddenly smiled brightly, as if everything that was happening delighted her. She was truly beautiful. Her smile lit up her face, and with a majestic, graceful gesture, she greeted Farasciati like an actress on stage. Now the whole trinity, husband, child, and sister-in-law, surrounded the fragile girl with pink like sakura petals, hair embracing her, filled with tenderness, warmth, unexpected spontaneity, and sincere family participation. Icelet, the little girl with fluffy pigtails, whom another man held in his arms with care and love, also wanted her older relative, the shining Circia, to hug her just as tightly, and tried to get ahead, but her father did not allow it. There was such a joyful, almost theatrical noise all around, full of voices, whispers, and laughter, that even an adult lady came out of the next room, frowning and holding a fan to her face, complaining about the inappropriate hubbub that was disturbing the noble peace of the evening. The young noblewomen, struck by the sudden news that fell like a bolt from the blue, froze in the marble silence of the hall, like fragile statues from the late Renaissance, involuntarily holding their breath and opening their strange eyes wide with excitement. Before them opened a rare, like a jewel from a secret box, opportunity to see Madame Gloria herself, a lady in a scarlet dress, with silver curls and a carved cane, whose majestic presence inspired awe in every witness. Noticing what was happening around her, she slightly opened her mouth in mild amazement and froze in the muffled silence, as if trying to comprehend the suddenly arising atmosphere that had unexpectedly engulfed the hall, dying down and attracting the gazes of the noblewomen present. She walked smoothly past the surprised nobles, quietly saying that, at her already venerable age, a ball is a difficult test, worthy of true heroes and great souls, to which Ferrasciati could not resist and objected that the Duchess was still full of strength and energy, despite the years and trials. Then, as if with a gentle gesture of fate and nobility, she extended her hand to the young girl, gently inviting her to dance, as if uniting two worlds, experience and youth, in one noble movement, filled with grace and a subtle hint of a bright future. After that, a smile filled with sincere warm gratitude and pride played on her face, and she said that Ferrasciati had the right to demand anything from her for saving them, be it lands, mines, or untold riches. After all, their duty and honor were no less important than the treasures of this world. The aristocrat, with dignity and calm, not wanting to accept any gifts or signs of attention, gently and confidently replied that she did not need anything, and the elderly woman in response only smiled, radiating inner warmth and the deepest respect, accepting this refusal. The lady, stunned and hardly able to believe her ears, stood still in amazement when she heard that she was sincerely ready to give her anything she wanted, without reserve, an astonishing and unparalleled generosity comparable to the greatest noble deeds, which are rarely found in the highest circles of society. After these words, the hall was filled with stormy applause, which gradually spread to all corners, creating an atmosphere of joy and admiration, as if the space itself was filled with light and ringing, reflecting the support and unanimity of all the nobles present. Ferrasciati, feeling confused and somewhat awkward, froze in place as the nobles around her suddenly began to applaud, not having a clear idea of the reason for this delight, simply giving in to the collective impulse and heartfelt sympathy for her. All this was explained by the fact that her husband's family, known as the Lafirian, enjoyed great respect and influence in society, as many were sincerely devoted to them and had a deep love and admiration for this noble and influential family. Outside the wide windows, heavy, dark clouds gradually thickened, foreshadowing imminent bad weather, as if nature itself reflected the tension and importance of the moment, adding drama and grandeur that engulfed the entire hall, filling it with an atmosphere of inevitable change. Ferrasciati, dressed in an exquisite blue dress, sat majestically at a massive table in a spacious hall, and opposite her stood a man with thick dark hair, whose figure radiated cold severity and genuine indifference, like a stone monument. It was the Archduke of Terdeo Dane Lafirion himself, dressed in an elegant dark suit, whose calm and almost indifferent expression reflected an inner severity as he listened attentively as Ferrasciati informed him of her intention to marry him, as if it were a business agreement and not a fateful union. After speaking, she frowned slightly, emphasizing the importance and temporary nature of her promise, clarifying that she agreed to link her fate with him for only 1 year, as if carefully trying on the role that she would have to play in someone else's life and society. Farashati's face remained serious and focused, her eyes concealing her emotions, as if she were preparing to pretend that she would become his wife for just a year, and she accepted this burden of a temporary role with an invisible inner courage and fortitude. Farashati herself was the daughter of a simple count. There was not a drop of pretension or luxury in her appearance. She was distinguished by an inconspicuous simplicity and quiet modesty, like an inconspicuous mouse, whose quiet voice in the world of loud titles is barely audible, but strong in its essence. Moreover, the girl was a deeply unhappy orphan, because her parents had irrevocably left this world, leaving her alone with a heavy burden of loss and defenseless against the cruel trials of fate, which turned out to be especially harsh and merciless to her. Her friends and relatives gathered together at the funeral to express their support and compassion. Many sobbed and anxiously asked how she was coping with grief and whether she had broken down under the weight of loss, trying to find the strength for a new life. But Farashati Lafirion herself stood motionless, without a single tear, like a statue, and the rain quietly flowed down her hair, leaving wet traces, while her face remained indifferent and cold, hiding the depth of her experiences and inner emptiness. Her lover, a man with thick brown hair and kind eyes, always stood by her side, invariably being her reliable support and protection in a world full of trials and disappointments, like a quiet harbor in the raging storm of her life. The caring stepmother, with her soft blue hair and a dark veil covering her head, stood nearby, clearly sobbing and not hiding her tears, as if her soul was broken by deep grief, and her heart was torn from the pain of loss and sincere compassion for the loved ones who were experiencing it with her. Next to her stood the girl who had replaced her younger sister, with swollen red cheeks and glistening tears in her eyes, her face expressing deep sadness and immeasurable longing, as if the whole weight of grief had fallen on her fragile shoulders, squeezing her heart with continuous pain and loneliness. All together, they stood side by side, united by common pain and sadness, living in dark sadness and melancholy, as if their hearts were connected by invisible threads of grief and loss, giving them no peace and no hope for quick relief and a bright future without suffering. In those moments, lying in bed, the girl realized her responsibility for her loved ones, believing that she was obliged to take care of them and protect them, admitting her mistakes and inner wrongness, which now weighed on her exhausted soul and did not give her peace either day or night. At the same time, a holiday was quietly taking place in the city, where bright, multicolored flags were fluttering, people were happily walking, and the shadows of the evening light played on the walls of houses, creating a contrast between the joy of the streets and the sadness that had engulfed her heart and her home, filling it with sadness. A loud, blinding fireworks display suddenly exploded outside the window, breaking the silence of the night with loud peals and bright flashes, as if the whole world was filled with the sounds of celebration, which awakened Lafirion Farashati in her bed from a terrible sleep and anxiety. Waking up in a cold sweat, Lafirion Farashati gasped and coughed painfully in her bed, her heart pounding with fear and helplessness, as if she were fighting an invisible enemy within herself, and the darkness of the night seemed even more oppressive and hopeless. Her lover stood next to her, quietly whispering ominous words with icy callousness in his voice, asking her to die quickly. It was then that he revealed himself as a hypocrite and a scoundrel, whose true intentions were hidden behind a mask of care and love. He spoke with a ruthless confidence that he was glad of this event, as if his soul rejoiced at the death of another, but his heart was cold, heartless, and merciless, devoid of sincere feelings and compassion, which only aggravated the bitterness of betrayal and loneliness. Meanwhile, the family that had once accepted her as their own waited for her to die soon, ignoring her suffering and believing that she was cursed, wanting her to pass away quietly, calmly, and unnoticed, without painful torment, and without unnecessary teachings, forgotten by everyone. Earlier, her sickly stepmother took off her mask of hypocrisy and coldly told her to stop looking at her with reproach and pity, because it was her father who cruelly put a noose around his daughter's neck, thereby condemning her to a painful fate and suffering. The noblewoman's eyes were forever imprinted with the terrible, horrific images of her lying family, who mocked her endlessly, turning the last minutes of her life into unbearable, painful suffering, leaving deep and excruciating wounds on her soul that would never heal. While the lady, trembling with fear and helplessness, tried to breathe at least a drop of life into her, the former lover coldly told the girl next to him that now they would become rich and would be able to enjoy everything that was previously inaccessible, forgetting about feelings, honor, and conscience. It turned out that he never loved Lafurian Ferrasciati, but only another lady who pretended to be her sister, playing on her feelings and betraying her trust for her own benefit and self-interest, deceiving everyone around her with her shameless hypocrisy. Smiling playfully, the man tenderly kissed his beloved, quietly whispering in her ear that now they would be together forever and all the troubles would finally end, opening a new chapter in their life, filled with secrets, deceit, and treachery. The blue-haired beauty suddenly smiled wildly and maliciously, her voice filled with mockery as she asked Lafurian Ferrasciati if she really thought that the young man had ever truly loved her, laughing at her naivety and trust. It turned out that this family had only staged a cruel show for her, disguising their true intentions behind a facade of nobility and friendship, in reality only wanting to appropriate her wealth and property, destroying everything that was dear to her heart and soul. The painful moments flashed through her mind when her so-called sister would deceitfully help and guide her, only to gain her trust and then betray her, leaving her alone to face betrayal and ruthless intrigue, like a shadow of false promises and deceit. Her dear lover, who had also deceived her, coldly and heartlessly proposed to marry him, presenting her with a bouquet of flowers filled with falsehood and empty words, as if to symbolize the heartless promises behind which there was only self-interest and cruel pretense for his own benefit. Everyone around skillfully and hypocritically pretended that they sincerely loved her, lied without a twinge of conscience, deceiving and betraying, creating an illusion of care and attention around Lafurian Ferrasciati, which collapsed with each new discovery and false promise, tearing the heart into pieces and leaving deep wounds. This finally broke Lafurian Ferrasciati. She could not hold back her tears, sobbing inconsolably, her face turned white like a snow-white canvas, reflecting the full depth of internal pain, despair, and betrayal that devastated her soul forever and irrevocably. Her mother suddenly smiled evilly, took a pillow, and, as if intending to finally suppress her will and spirit, told her not to worry and not to resist, because after her death, they would take care of her money and inheritance, depriving her of her last hope and consolation in this cruel world. But then a new day came, and a warm light shone through the window, as if promising the beginning of something new and unknown, light after a long and dark darkness, a chance for hope and change that Lafurian Ferrasciati had yet to accept and experience in her life. Lafurian Ferrasciati woke up with a disturbing thought in her head that she should have been dead by now, but for some mysterious and incomprehensible reason, her life was still going on, causing her both surprise and bewilderment. The noblewoman stood up with a surprised and stunned expression on her face, as if trying to comprehend whether she was really alive, because deep down she only prayed for death. But despite everything, fate gave her the opportunity to continue to exist and fight on. She slowly walked towards the balcony, leaning on the railing, and wondered if she was just in a state of deep sleep or oblivion, or if perhaps she had actually been given a second chance to right her past mistakes and find her true path in this cruel world. However, events began to develop rapidly further, as if repeating all the same moments and scenes that she saw in her dream, which caused her mixed feelings of anxiety and hope, because reality seemed to be intertwined with visions from her subconscious. To all the numerous questions of the servants who surrounded her with care and curiosity, she invariably received the same answer, which only increased the mystery of what was happening and made her think about what role she was destined to play in this intricate plot of fate. And the stepmother and her younger sister continued to smile so artificially and coldly, as if nothing terrible had happened, still masterfully pretending and hiding their true intentions behind masks of lies and hypocrisy, which made Lafurian's heart clench with pain and distrust. The lady clenched her fist to her chest, feeling as if invisible chains were squeezing her breath, and those painful sensations of suffocation from her dream suddenly became amazingly real, running shivers through her entire body and causing a terrible chill, reminding her of those terrible moments when she was on the brink of life and death. Lafirion Ferishati remembered very well how her own family, with cold cruelty and indifference, wanted her dead, as if her life was only a nuisance to them. And even in those difficult moments, she was betrayed by those who were supposed to love and protect her from harm and injustice. And then one day, her lover, full of determination and sincere tenderness, ran to her with a ring and a lush bouquet of flowers, wanting to sincerely propose to her to marry him, hoping that their union would be the beginning of a new, happy, and long chapter in their life. However, instead of accepting this long-awaited and important offer, Lafirion Ferishati, unexpectedly for everyone, burst into tears, and overcome by deep inner pain and unbearable doubts, buried her face in her knees, as if trying to hide from the world all the bitterness that had been accumulating in her tormented soul for years. At that very moment, it suddenly became clear to her that she had gone back in time, that she had found herself in her own painful past, and that everything she had ever believed in was one long, carefully woven lie, surrounded by deceit and betrayal from people who could never be trusted completely. Then, kneeling in bitter despair and deep sadness, she firmly decided that this time she would do everything possible to protect at any cost her fragile life, her dignity, and that precious inheritance, which had now become her only support and hope for a bright future and peace. Through the hot tears that Lafirion Ferishati was struggling to hold back, her stubborn and determined gaze suddenly lit up with a bright spark of hope and inner strength, as if a new fire had been lit deep within her soul, capable of guiding her through the darkest trials of life. Some time passed, and a dark sky hung over the city, covered with heavy leaden clouds, reflecting the turbulent changes that were taking place in the soul and fate of the young woman, ready at last to meet the inevitable with an open heart and determination. After that fateful day, the girl finally realized the full weight and bitterness of reality, gathered all her courage, and went straight to the Archduke to propose to him, hoping for a new chapter in her life, full of opportunities and changes. At this important and decisive moment, she firmly and with dignity asked her now ex-lover to leave forever, rejecting the past in order to make room for a new beginning and find the long-awaited inner peace and freedom. After she quietly left the room, Lafirion Ferishati herself was overcome with deep fear and unceasing anxiety, afraid that her evil stepmother and treacherous younger sister might try to make another treacherous attempt on her fragile life, not giving her a moment's peace. Lost in dark thoughts, the girl wondered what kind of terrible and sinister curse could have been placed on her, why exactly she died prematurely in her past life, and what mysterious forces could have haunted her through time, squeezing her heart with fear and uncertainty. Suddenly, her dark thoughts were interrupted by the stern, but at the same time soft voice of the butler, who called her to go to the great hall, where an important and influential nobleman was already waiting, ready for a decisive meeting that could forever change the fate of the young woman. Gathering all her willpower and tenacity, Lafirion Ferishati resolutely took a step forward, the heel of her shoe hitting the cold stone tiles with a sharp sound, echoing throughout the spacious hall, as if symbolizing the beginning of a new chapter in her difficult and challenging life. The girl walked slowly and confidently through the massive, carved large doors of the luxurious mansion, feeling the cool air touch her skin, and with slight excitement headed inside, ready to meet the fate that awaited her beyond the threshold. In the cozy, softly lit study of the mansion, Archduke Turdeo Dane Lafirion was already waiting for her, dressed in an impeccable blue suit, standing majestically at a heavy carved table, ready for a serious conversation and new decisions. Turning around, he cast a cold, piercing gaze at her. His face was pale and lifelessly cold, like an icy wind that pierces to the very bones, leaving not a drop of warmth and kindness in its depths, causing anxiety and fear. Right from the threshold, the beauty loudly and confidently greeted the young man, with determination and firmness in her voice, declaring that she had come here not just like that, but with a serious intention, to marry him, changing the course of their fate forever, and accepting her new role. Their ancestor received a high award, an honorary title for outstanding achievements, thanks to which he was awarded the title of Duke, which forever inscribed his name in the history of the family and raised the family to a new level of nobility and eternal glory. At present, the aristocratic heir and successor of the family was Archduke Terdeo Dane Lafurian, who sat in a heavy chair with an impassive and cold face, hiding his thoughts and emotions under a mask of deep indifference and absolute calm. Then there was a bloody war with a neighboring kingdom, at the beginning of which everyone believed in their victory. But fate turned out differently, and despite hopes, their army suffered a crushing defeat, leaving a bitter aftertaste in the hearts and memory of the people forever. At that moment, the battle flag was raised, calling for the battle to begin, and the Duke, together with his faithful knights, entered into a fierce battle where the fate of the kingdom was being decided, and every moment was filled with tension, courage, and readiness to sacrifice everything for the sake of final victory. The hostile kingdom was instantly defeated, and after a fierce struggle, a glorious victory was won, which became a symbol of courage and unity, and the Duke and his knights forever entered history as the defenders of their people and the guardians of the long-awaited peace. The people greeted the Duke and his army with loud and joyful cries of delight, as they returned tired but proud after a long and bloody battle, filling the streets of the city with the sounds of triumph and jubilation of the people, filled with excitement and hope. The aristocrat himself briefly visited the capital to settle important matters and carry out necessary assignments, after which he hurried as quickly as possible to return to his family home and estates, where the long-awaited peace and comfort awaited him, so close and dear to his heart and soul. When he passed by the crowd, people greeted him with seriousness on their faces, and in their eyes one could read a dual feeling, admiration and awe, mixed with barely noticeable excitement, because his exploits aroused both pride and deep fears in their hearts. Some called him a hero, bowing before his courage and unbending bravery, while others whispered behind his back, accusing him of cruelty and ruthlessness, calling him a bloodthirsty monster, which plunged his name into the darkness of endless gossip and suspicion. On the table, covered with a thin snow-white tablecloth, stood a cup of hot aromatic tea, next to which lay neatly removed white gloves, like a symbol of fatigue and the heavy burden that the Duke carried on his shoulders after a long, exhausting battle and trials. The man, looking at the lady with incomprehension, asked her with a certain shadow of doubt and wariness in his voice why she wanted this marriage, why she wanted to link her fate with him, when the very history of their relationship was so confusing and complicated in reality. Archduke Terdeo Dane Lafurian had previously been in a marriage that ended in divorce, and his ex-wife, with bitterness and disappointment in her voice, left, accusing him of being a terrible husband, unable to give her love and happiness, leaving pain and emptiness. The girl clasped her hands on the dress in front of her, squeezing them tightly from deep anxiety and excitement that squeezed her heart like a cold iron hoop, not allowing her to utter a word calmly and confidently, afraid to hear an answer. After a long pause, Farashati gathered all her courage and explained that her family had maliciously plotted to kill her, pursuing only one goal: to take possession of her inheritance, for which they were ready to cross any moral and human boundaries, forgetting about blood and family ties. The cold young man interrupted her mid-sentence, his eyes shining with cruelty and incomprehension. He asked with mockery and doubt whether she had really made such a long and painful journey just to tell him this terrible truth, which seemed to mean so little to him. A heavy and oppressive silence hung between them, as if time itself had stopped, and the guy, unable to bear the tension, covered his face with his hand, sitting, trying to hide his fatigue and deep inner pain, which he carefully hid from everyone around him, so as not to show the slightest weakness and worries. He spoke a few tired words to her to stop her from worrying so much about the inheritance, explaining that it was not worth such destructive worries and should not destroy her peace of mind, trying to soften her suffering a little, although there was still bitterness and deep regret in his voice. After these words, he slowly stood up from his seat, resolutely heading towards the exit. declaring that there would be no marriage and it would be better for both of them to separate, as if putting a final and irrevocable end to their conversation and relationship, closing this painful chapter of their lives forever. The lady, struck by his firm determination, opened her shining golden eyes wide, full of surprise, pain, and incomprehension, not believing what she heard and not wanting to let go of the situation without a desperate struggle and attempts to change the course of events for the better. Suddenly, she grabbed his hand tightly, as if clinging to the last thin thread of hope, not letting him go, and her voice trembled with emotion as she begged him to stop, hoping that he would reconsider his decision and stay by her side, despite everything and all the insurmountable difficulties. The man suddenly froze, opening his eyes in surprise, as if he had not expected such pressure and determination from the girl who had so brazenly and boldly taken him by the hand, not letting him leave, which clearly knocked him off balance and caught him by surprise. Without thinking twice, the Duke abruptly pushed the girl away from him, showing firmness and coldness, because no one had ever dared to pester him so brazenly before, especially at such an important moment, when he was trying to leave and end this conversation as quickly as possible in order to avoid further conflicts and emotions. Farashati, suddenly feeling a sharp repulsion, recoiled, losing her balance, and blood immediately began to flow on her hand. The wound turned out to be serious and left no doubt that the Duke's act was strong and painful enough for her. Her finger was cut, and the scarlet liquid of blood slowly flowed down her skin, leaving a noticeable mark and causing the girl painful sensations, which, despite all her spirit and determination, could not help but affect her condition, reminding her of the fragility of the human body and soul. After she looked at the wound, the girl suddenly realized that the blood on her finger did not belong to her at all, but to the guy, because it was her ring that scratched and wounded his hand, leaving a bright mark and evidence of an unexpected collision between them. Duke Terdeo Dan Lafirian, showing his rudeness and coldness, answered her sharply, strongly recommending not to waste his precious time in vain and to leave immediately, as if he wanted to break off any further communication, not wanting to continue this exhausting conversation and emotions. Thus, the lady was left alone in the spacious hall, hearing only distant steps that were slowly moving away. These were the steps of the Duke, confident and decisive, but at the same time detached, creating an atmosphere of loneliness and alienation around her. However, suddenly she took a decisive step forward and shouted at his back, addressing the Duke by name, begging him to stop, to give her a chance to hear her and not leave everything as if their conversation was truly hopeless. Dear Farashati firmly and confidently stated that there was also a benefit to him in this union, because such a marriage was important to him as a political and social turning point, capable of changing much in his life and position among the aristocracy. The reason why Duke Terdeo Dane Lafirian was forced to go back to the capital was that he did not want to marry the imperial daughter at all, despite persistent invitations and pressure from the highest authorities. The emperor had previously called the Duke several times to visit the capital to meet his young daughter and prepare a successful marriage agreement that would strengthen their political positions and alliances between influential families. But Terdeo remained indifferent to such plans. The man was completely alien and unfamiliar with everything that concerned marriage, family ties, and social intrigues associated with them. So he tried to avoid such topics and obligations that were imposed on him like a heavy burden, not wanting to change his life for the sake of someone else's ambitions. As a result, the frightened and depressed imperial daughter, seeing the frightening and cold appearance of the Duke, could not stand it and ran away in tears, feeling fear and despair that her future could turn out completely differently than she imagined or would like. Terdeo Dane Lafirion, turning to the lady with an icy and impassive expression on his face, calmly and coldly asked what exactly she was talking about, demonstrating his indifference and desire to understand the situation without unnecessary emotions. At that moment, Farashati froze in place, overcome with fear and not daring to move. But despite her inner turmoil, with stubbornness and firmness in her voice, she declared that it was much more advantageous for the Duke to marry her, and not the young empress, who was still studying at the academy and was not ready for marriage. Stubbornly and with determination, The girl declared that it was much more advantageous for him to marry her rather than the young empress, who was still studying at the academy and was not ready for the serious responsibilities associated with marriage and palace intrigues. The guy, puzzled and trying to understand how the lady could know so many details about plans and motives, began to argue, not believing that someone could have such information without special access to the secrets of the upper classes and hidden intrigues. In response, Farishati, without losing confidence and keeping her cool, folded her hands in front of her and then insistently repeated that she was indeed needed by the Duke and occupied an important place in his life and plans, which he could not ignore or reject. The lady insistently and firmly suggested that their marriage last only 1 year, and after that, they would calmly and without unnecessary questions dissolve it. As if removing the burden of long-term obligations from themselves, but at the same time retaining the benefits of the union for a limited period of time. A tense silence hung between the couple. The aristocrat was deeply immersed in thought over her words. His gaze became thoughtful, focused and serious, while she patiently and hopefully awaited the long-awaited answer, ready to hear the fateful decision. She clasped her hands tightly in front of her, filled with excitement and trepidation, as if begging and asking for a blessing, insistently asking the guy to agree to her proposal, fully understanding that not only her personal future, but also the fate of many people close and dear to her depended on this decision. Horror seemed to grip the lady's body. Her heart began to beat faster, because fear gripped her soul. Her evil stepmother could send hired killers from among the count's servants and people, ready to mercilessly carry out any order, depriving the girl of peace and confidence in safety. Suddenly, all of Farishati's attention was focused on the Duke again as he spoke coldly and decisively, declaring that she understood nothing of the intricacies of political games and palace intrigues, which were much deeper and more complex than her understanding and knowledge. In a cold and angry voice, Terdeo Dane Lafirion said that in fact the emperor would like to see him married to the fourth daughter, and not the seventh, and the very fact of Farishati's persistence began to irritate and create more and more tension and alienation between them. Overcome with deep shock and indescribable fear due to the unexpected and such abrupt rudeness, the lady froze in place, pressing her hands to her chest, as if trying to keep her fragile heart from breaking and hold on to the last grains of hope for a bright future. The Duke, who until that moment had remained her only and last hope, was now mercilessly and coldly moving away, leaving her alone with the bitterness of disappointment and a heavy emptiness, as if forever closing the door to her dreams and salvation. At this most unexpected and alarming moment, the woman's fragile heart began to beat with extraordinary force and anxiety, and her head was suddenly seized by a sharp and excruciating pain, like a storm covering a calm sea, depriving her of balance and peace in her soul and body. Farishati suddenly and without warning collapsed onto the cold floor, deprived of all strength and consciousness, as if weakened by the raging storm within herself, instantly plunging into a deep abyss of darkness, where time and space lost all meaning and significance for her. She suddenly and painfully remembered that terrible, almost unbearable moment when her stepmother squeezed her mercilessly, depriving her of breath and peace. And now she suddenly felt the same excruciating pain and helplessness, as if fate had again brought the same darkness and suffering upon her. In complete panic and uncontrollable despair, Terdeo Dane Lafirion rushed towards her quickly, not fully understanding what had happened to her and why she had suddenly collapsed unconscious, leaving him overcome with anxiety and complete helplessness in the face of this sudden and terrible misfortune. The storm raged with relentless and ferocious force. The rain poured down in buckets, and the sky hung like a heavy cloud, radiating impenetrable darkness and gloom, as if nature itself was mourning and crying along with people, foreshadowing something terrible and inevitable that was soon to happen. People, with heavy hearts and wet clothes, dug new deep graves, because once again, in the pouring rain, another person had passed away, and this sad reality became an unbearable burden that they were forced to accept with bitterness and resignation. Suddenly, like a bright lightning flashing right next to the men, there was a deafening roar of thunder, and they instantly stopped in their tracks, engulfed in a wild and frightening silence that hung around them like a terrible omen and an ominous sign of coming trials and disasters. The noblewoman, whom everyone had hopelessly taken for dead and had already mourned, suddenly rose unexpectedly from under the cold earth, letting out a cry of horror that pierced the silence of the night, as if death itself had decided to challenge and disturb the souls of the living around in this gloomy place. With wild cries of panic and all-consuming horror, the guys, seized with uncontrollable fear and horror, rushed to run away, frightened and unable to believe that the lady had really risen from the dead and appeared to them like a ghost from another world, violating all the laws of nature and life. Ferishati, with eyes full of horror, confusion, and despair, looked at her trembling hands, realizing that she was sitting in a cold and damp hole, surrounded by dense earth on all sides, and that, in spite of everything, she was still alive, although she almost died, balancing on the thin line between life and death. At that very moment, it became almost impossible for her to breathe, because there was impenetrable darkness and heavy silence all around, as if the night itself had closed all paths and cut off hope. But suddenly, in the distance, on the horizon, a bright and alluring light flashed, giving her a weak but sincere hope and a sign of salvation. The lady sat on the cold ground in complete bewilderment, shock and confusion, not fully understanding how she managed to survive, because they were ready to bury her, but fate decreed otherwise, allowing her to go through the darkness and the most difficult trials, returning to life again. The men who were digging the grave rushed towards the knights and the Duke in panic, and with alarm in their voices, shouting at the top of their voices that the noblewoman was not dead at all, but alive, as if she had miraculously escaped certain death and burial underground. In tears, covered in sweat and trembling, they cried out that Ferishati was a witch, endowed with terrible power, capable of cheating death and returning from the darkness, inspiring fear and mistrust in even the bravest and most battle-hardened warriors and nobles. The ground was cold and damp from the incessant rain. Drops of water were dripping from the hair of the lady, who was still sitting in shock, as if lost in this dark and inhospitable world, trying to comprehend what had happened and understand how she managed to survive in such terrible conditions. The knights and the Duke, driven by curiosity and deep emotion, approached her closer to see this miracle with their own eyes, whether she had really come to life, or whether before them was simply a ghost who had come in the middle of the night to disturb the peace and faith of everyone around. Terdeo Dane Lafurion, clearly amazed and unable to take his eyes off Ferishati, carefully studied her every movement and facial expression, trying to understand how and why she was able to survive in those terrible and almost unthinkable circumstances that seemed impossible for an ordinary person. Looking down, the man was deep in thought, as if the most complex and disturbing thoughts arose in his soul, trying to unravel the mysterious secret of why exactly Ferishati remained alive, despite all the horrors and trials that she endured in this dark and harsh country, full of dangers. After a long and painful pause, he slowly and carefully extended his hand towards her, as if offering support and hope, inviting her to begin a new path, freed from the burdens of the past that could destroy any soul, but not hers, as if offering a second chance at fate. He walked straight towards the lady, his white-gloved hand extended confidently and decisively, like a symbol of peace and a new beginning, ready to help her stand up and restore her faith in herself, in the future, and in the possibility of healing after so much torment and suffering she had had to endure. Sympathetically and with genuine warmth in his voice, Terdeo Dane Lafurion quietly said that he never wanted such a hard and painful fate for her, and admitted that he would not mind starting all over again, giving them both a chance for a new life, hope, and happiness together. The noblewoman slowly and with effort extended her trembling, scratched hand in response, trying to rise and escape from the cold, damp, dark pit as quickly as possible, because her desperate desire to return to life and free herself from the tormenting darkness was stronger than fear, fatigue, and pain. The rain continued to pour. The sky remained heavy, gray and gloomy, as if reflecting the heavy mood and hopelessness of what was happening around, while the silence, broken only by the steady sound of drops of water, filled the air with cold, dampness, and a feeling of the abyss. Entering the spacious, slightly darkened room of the ancient mansion, Terdeo Dane Leferian, with determination and a cold gaze, sent the knights away, because now he no longer needed them, and he wanted to be alone with Ferishati to carefully examine her condition and help her gradually recover. Ferishati stood in the man's large coat, which was too big for her, but warmed her and protected her from the piercing cold wind. She stood quietly, serenely, despite all the horror and suffering that she had experienced, and waited, as if hoping for the best and holding back the raging storm of emotions inside herself. The maiden was all dirty, wet, exhausted, and wounded. Her gaze was directed downwards, at the floor, empty and lifeless, as if the soul had already detached itself from the body, and only a thin but strong thread of hope still held her on the edge between deep despair and a weak possibility of returning to life and light. Suddenly, Ferishati quietly but clearly raised her voice, asking the agonizing question of whether the Duke really wanted to kill her, as if trying to understand the true intentions and feelings of the man who held her fate in his hands. Terdeo Dane Leferian, in response, smiling with a slight mockery, noticed that she was biting her nails, noting that this was her bad and unusual habit, which he noted with surprise and some interest in her behavior at that tense moment. Ferishati, confused and not understanding why such a strange question was being asked, stood silently, agreeing that the Duke might indeed have meant to do this, and internally accepting the bitter truth that lay heavily on her heart. The man, showing her his hand with a noticeable wound, explained that this wound appeared precisely because she tried to grab him, and his voice was soft, as if trying to soften the situation and convey his feelings to her without anger and malice. After these words, Terdeo Dane Leferian suddenly turned away, as if hiding his true thoughts, and, after a short silence, quietly said that perhaps he would still consider her proposal of marriage, opening the door to a new, unexpected life for both of them. Noticing that a fresh, bright red and painful wound had appeared on the Duke's hand from her sudden capture, the noblewoman froze in complete shock, not understanding how she could have hurt him like that, and seemed numb from the unexpectedness and her own strength that had manifested itself at this critical moment. After this, Terdeo Dane Leferian slowly and confidently extended his free hand to her, adding seriously and insistently that it was now extremely important for him to understand how exactly she would cope with his difficult test, because their future and much more depended on it. Before Ferishati could even ask what this mysterious test was, Terdeo Dane Leferion suddenly and abruptly closed her mouth with his strong hand, not letting her finish and not allowing her to express her doubts and fears, as if demonstrating his complete control and power over the situation. The noblewoman, feeling the strong and relentless pressure, began to choke, gasping for air, desperately trying to regain her breath and gather her strength, while simultaneously struggling with the panic and confusion that had overwhelmed her at that critical and tense moment. Terdeo Dane Leferion looked at her carefully and with deep attention, noting that she had finally woken up, that in her eyes there appeared a firm determination and inner strength that could help them get through all the trials and difficulties that awaited them ahead. All this time, it turned out that the nobleman was sitting calmly opposite her bed, and on both sides there were burning candles, softly illuminating the room and creating an atmosphere of awakening and mysterious hope, filling the space with light warmth and tranquility. The servants, standing up straight and feeling deep respect, bowed politely when they were given permission to leave the room, realizing that their presence was no longer required, and quietly withdrew, leaving the Duke and Ferishati alone in this difficult but fateful moment. Ferishati herself, still slightly trembling from the experience and excitement, slowly sat up in bed, sighing with difficulty, and realized that, it would seem, she should have died. But something incredible and inexplicable was happening to her now, leaving her in confusion and disarray. In a trembling voice, interrupting herself, she timidly and stuttered the question that had long tormented her soul. Why was the man who tried to kill her now showing concern and trying to help, as if an invisible connection had appeared between them that was difficult to understand. Suddenly, Terdeo Dane Lafirian, with a serious and heavy expression on his face, declared that his entire family was cursed, and this heavy silence that hung between them, as if frozen in time, made both of them think about the power of fate and about those invisible ties that bind their lives. Sitting in a high chair with a serious expression, Terdeo Dane Lafirion explained in detail that each of his relatives had a deadly poison hidden in their bodies, which allowed them to live after being poisoned, but at the same time, the touch of their blood became deadly to others, as if it were a poisonous trap. Previously, the servants had repeatedly warned that anyone who got too close to the Duke's family did not live long, and this sad truth seemed to haunt everyone who dared to approach their home, turning closeness into a real threat to life. And then, like a sudden cold wind, the lady finally realized that the man really thought she was dead, and that was why he wanted to bury her quickly, and not at all because he wanted her dead, which forever changed her perception of what was happening and his intentions. Closing his eyes and taking a deep breath, Terdeo Dane Lafirion said with unexpected sincerity and surprise in his voice that it was truly an incredible miracle to him that Farashati had remained alive after drinking his blood, despite all the mortal risks and curses. When the girl tried to justify herself and explain that she knew nothing about his terrible secret, Terdeo Dane Lafirion smiled softly and nodded, understanding her deep fear and sincere desire to escape responsibility, but at the same time not allowing her to escape the consequences of her actions and decisions. When the young man began to carefully and gradually approach her, the girl covered her face with her hands in panic, loudly screaming for mercy and protection, as if trying to fence herself off from the inevitable and hide from those feelings and decisions that suddenly covered her head and suffocated her. However, judging by his facial expression and gaze, the Duke clearly did not wish her any more harm. On the contrary, his soft and warm smile seemed to promise protection, support, and hope, which made Farashati calm down a little and feel something new and unexpected inside herself. After which, he slowly and respectfully sat down next to her level position, with attention and tenderness, and quietly said that for exactly 1 year she should become his wife, which put her before a new, incomprehensible, and terrible choice that would change her whole life forever. Uncomprehending and dumbfounded, Farashati suddenly shuddered and froze. Tears began to well up in her eyes, because just recently this same man was categorically against such an idea, and now her soul was overwhelmed by doubt, pain, and fear of an unknown future. The sky outside the window gradually cleared up, the clouds slowly went away, and the weather noticeably improved, filling the room with freshness and soft light, as if promising a new day and hope for a better future, which seemed closer and clearer, giving a feeling of peace and renewal. Previously, the man had held the hands of another person tightly in his own, saying with confidence and warmth that his father would never harm him, promising protection and care, which were the best consolation for the baby after difficult trials, instilling hope and security. Then, after the death of her mother, her father always repeated these words to the little girl, filling her heart with faith and warmth, supporting and protecting her as best he could, despite his own pain and grief, which did not leave him for a moment, instilling strength and confidence in difficult moments. But soon he found himself a new wife and a little daughter, brought them to his home, trying to create a new family and start life anew. Although Farashati felt that part of her past and memory remained forever out of reach, and her soul was filled with mixed feelings and doubts. Meanwhile, Farashati had grown into a real beauty, strong and proud, and now stood at the grave of her father, who suffered from poor health, feeling mixed emotions of bitterness, loss, and the tender love that bound them even after death, leaving her with a deep sense of sorrow and respect. On the cold, smooth stone lay a carefully arranged bouquet of bright yellow flowers, which seemed to be trying to brighten up the gloomy and gray day with their warm and gentle energy, as if reminding that life goes on no matter what, giving hope and light. Looking with tired eyes at the cloudy and heavy sky, she quietly turned in her thoughts to her late father, trembling and resolutely saying that she had decided to marry a military man, hoping to find in this union support, protection, and peace for herself and the future. Her stepmother, standing quietly behind her, addressed her by name, calling her tenderly and anxiously, as if trying to break through the cold and distant wall of misunderstanding, to show that she was not indifferent to the experiences and feelings of her adopted daughter, despite all the difficulties in their relationship. Her family and lover, who had only pretended to be kind before, were now sincerely interested in whether everything was okay with her, and even offered to appoint her a worthy representative to manage the county, realizing that it would be very difficult for the girl to take on such responsibility. While tidying herself up and trying to hide the tears that were welling up, the stepmother quietly said that it was incredibly difficult for her to watch her adopted daughter suffer, feeling at the same time guilt, regret, and pain that tormented her soul and made her think about the past, present, and future. But even then, hiding behind the young girl's back, evil and insidious people secretly made cruel and dangerous plans to kill her in order to ruthlessly seize her inheritance, which promised to be very significant and attracted many greedy eyes and hands. Ferishati, with melancholy and bitterness in her soul, lowered the gaze of her bright golden eyes down, plunging into deep and disturbing thoughts about her fate, about the betrayal and dangers that surrounded her, trying to find at least a drop of hope or a way out of this difficult and painful situation. At that moment, she handed her stepmother a letter written with secrecy and caution, and she, not immediately understanding its contents, took the message in her hands with surprise and caution, trying to read the hidden meaning and unravel the true intentions of its author. The Trinity, which included the stepmother, began to read the letter together, carefully and excitedly looking at each line, and when they realized the content of the message, they froze in horror, realizing how serious and dangerous this secret was, which could change their destinies forever, radically changing the course of events. Farashati smiled tensely, trying to hide her excitement, and confidently said that she had made a firm decision to marry the Duke, which shocked and froze her adoptive family, who only recently seemed like real close people to her. The adoptive relatives, who had been pretending to be caring and kind for a long time, suddenly froze in amazement and silence upon hearing her words, after which, turning their backs to her, they began to scream, not understanding and not accepting such an unexpected decision, because for them, she had always been an adopted daughter and sister. They could not believe why Farashati, who had previously been so attached to them and even loved a guy from their circle, now suddenly decided to break all ties, abandon everything familiar, and go down a completely different path, which seemed incomprehensible and treacherous to them. The stepmother, standing next to her with a dull smile on her face and a cold gaze, as if holding back her gloating, suddenly noticed and quietly said that her uncle from the east had recently come to the girl, which added tension and a premonition of impending changes to the atmosphere, like thunderclouds approaching their destinies. Now the lady, along with her daughter and her boyfriend, had to leave the main room, walk away, leaving behind all previous connections and memories, as if forever closing one chapter of her difficult life, full of trials and betrayals that had long exhausted her. The noblewoman's former lover, stunned and unable to understand what was happening, stood in complete shock, not believing that the lady was really leaving, although he had previously been confident in his love for her and had repeatedly demonstrated his feelings in the most sincere way, hoping for her return. The noblewoman, as if unperturbed, did not pay the slightest attention to the loud cries and pleas that were heard behind her, did not turn around even for a moment, decisively leaving the fake relatives far behind, as if breaking free from everything that had once bound and strangled her. And so, finally, Farashati and the Duke had a solemn wedding in an ancient church with bright stained-glass windows, where the light penetrated through the colored glass, creating a magical atmosphere and emphasizing the importance of this fateful moment in their lives. Since then, a legend has developed that between them there was a true, sincere love at first sight, which was able to overcome all obstacles and trials to unite them forever in a strong and happy union, which delighted and inspired everyone around for many years. Unbeknownst to everyone else, they had drawn up a secret contract in which the lady was guaranteed complete safety and protection from any threats, while the man could calmly and thoroughly study the reasons why his curse had no effect on her, hoping to find a solution and perhaps a way to remove the spell. Lafirion Ferishati, shining in an airy, dazzling white wedding dress, embroidered with pearls and silver threads, gently leaned on the arm of her husband, impeccable in an elegant dark suit, and together they seemed to embody the cherished harmony of love. Meanwhile, a sudden booming click of the oak door behind them, like a distant clap of thunder, pierced the silence, frightening the birds outside the stained glass windows and causing the flower-decorated hall to shudder, as if fate itself had marked the beginning of their common journey. And the lady, dressed in an elegant dress of a deep emerald shade, accompanied by her new husband, was left alone with him in their secluded home, where everything breathed peace, comfort, silence, faith, hope, and a quiet beginning to a new chapter of their lives. In the spacious hallway, armed knights were already waiting for them, hurrying to convey important news. They turned to their master to warn him that unexpected, but probably significant and respected guests had arrived, requiring immediate attention and honor. Arm in arm with her lover, radiating calm, dignity, and inner strength, the lady gracefully walked forward, slowly and confidently stepping on the soft carpet, as if she herself embodied the grandeur, grace, wisdom, and beauty of the new role she had entered into without fear or doubt. With a slight blush and shining eyes, still overcome with emotions of happiness, the lady felt long-awaited relief. For the first time in a long time, her heart beat calmly, because now, it seemed, nothing in this fragile and changeable world threatened her happiness anymore. Their spontaneous, almost sudden marriage turned into a real spectacle. In expensive, richly decorated clothes, the two of them stood a little awkwardly in front of the assembled people, as if they had forgotten how to behave in front of so many curious, attentive eyes. The majestic hall, filled with luxury, the shimmer of crystal chandeliers, and the subtle aroma of incense, was full of nobles, and each of them, putting aside their glasses of wine, watched the couple with genuine interest, because the news of the Duke's wedding spread like thunder. The lady felt painfully awkward under the weight of the attentive, searching and slightly mocking glances directed from all sides. Those present were inexpressibly interested to know who this woman was, who had decided to become the legal wife of such an influential, powerful man. But suddenly, completely unexpectedly, Lafirion Ferishati, as if pricked by an invisible pain, shuddered sharply in her husband's strong, steel-like embrace, and stepped back, as if something inside her resisted this entire complex, solemn production. Her husband, raising his eyebrows high and looking intently into her eyes, did not hold back, and asked a direct question. Was she really ready to extend their marriage contract? Or was all this just a temporary union for the sake of power, profit, order, convenience, and survival? Lafirion Ferishati, keeping a soft and slightly mysterious expression on her face, smiled sweetly at her husband, and with a slight, barely noticeable mockery in her voice, replied that she might think about this proposal if she found a place for it in her heart, hope, warmth, trust, and peace. After that, she walked separately, not holding her husband's hand, but still next to him, striding confidently forward along the paved path, as if demonstrating to everyone present her calm, inner freedom, strength, determination, dignity, and a barely noticeable shadow of loneliness. The whole evening, like an echo of a dream, was reminiscent of the rustling of leaves, the splash of fountains, the trembling of trees, and children's laughter that could be heard in the distance, leaving in the air a feeling of something unsaid, fragile, exciting, disturbing, and as if invisibly reaching out to her from the future. The interested nobleman slowly turned to his refined companion, when she, without taking her eyes off him, suddenly said that she had only one, but very important question left, which she had not dared to ask for many months, perhaps years, full of fear and doubt. Once upon a time, on the day of her supposed and mysterious death, Lafirion Ferishati, according to her own family, died from an ancient, tormenting, and cursed spell that had been passed down through the female line for centuries and secretly dominated her mind. Walking alongside her companion along the stone path, among flower-covered arches, whispering trees and rustling leaves, Leferion suddenly, with genuine interest and a slight wariness in her voice, asked if it was possible that his ancient family had once sold their own blood as poison. The man, hearing such an unusual, frightening, and sharp question, involuntarily shuddered. His face froze in an expression of deep shock, and his eyes widened, as if she had touched something ancient, dangerous, forbidden, secret, painful, and covered with a layer of oblivion. With an irritated sigh, almost angrily, he asked her again, surprised by such an accusation, on what grounds exactly she had decided to ask such an impudent and humiliating question, casting a shadow on the honor of his entire ancient, noble, proud, glorious, and respected family. All this turned out to be only a figment of the young maiden's imagination, who, quickening her pace, walked forward, thinking that perhaps she should not have asked the nobleman such a delicate question about whether he had ever sold his own blood as a deadly poison. Archduke Terdeo Dane Leferion, slightly surprised and puzzled, looked after her attentively, trying to understand what exactly caused such strange and unpredictable behavior of his new, mysterious, and rebellious wife, who behaved completely differently than he expected. Ahead of the couple, like a boundary between their personal world and the hustle and bustle of everyday life, a noisy city appeared with its busy streets, numerous people, rushing carriages, tall houses, and narrow streets that seemed simultaneously alive and mysterious. The pair, consisting of two and accompanied by two knights, moved forward carefully and silently through the streets of the city, trying not to attract unnecessary attention from passers-by, in order to avoid unnecessary gossip and unwanted glances that could complicate their situation. Suddenly, as if from nowhere, a loud, commanding voice rang out, causing them to turn sharply. It was a call to the Archduke of Terdeo Dane Leferion by his full title, sounding with such force that it echoed through the narrow streets and caused passers-by to stop. The voice belonged to the fourth princess, Ina Castor, a girl with luxurious golden hair that sparkled like the sun's rays, and bright green eyes that seemed both piercing and enchanting, her beauty attracting glances and inspiring respect at the same time. She was the heir to the throne, but at that moment she looked angry and irritated, her lips pressed together, her umbrella clutched tightly in her hand, which seemed more like a weapon than an accessory, and she stared at the newlyweds, clearly displeased with their presence or some action of theirs. Despite her title and status, the heir to the throne suffered from poor health from birth. Her body was fragile, and her spirit sometimes seemed to be oppressed by a serious illness that limited her strength and abilities so much that she could hardly leave her chambers. She spent every day in bed, forced to remain recumbent and powerless, unable to get up and participate in social events, which gave rise to irritation and resentment towards a fate that she could not change even with the greatest persistence. However, suddenly, as if by a miracle, the veil of illness dissipated, and there she stood before them, the heiress herself, dressed in an elegant dress, with a cold and angry gaze directed straight at the newlyweds, as if ready to challenge them and show her power. With a polite, slight bow, one of the nobles addressed the princess in a reserved manner, asking what exactly she was doing here and why she had disturbed the peace of this meeting, trying to ease the tension and avoid a terrible and huge conflict. Clutching her graceful but hard umbrella in her hand in annoyance, the heiress responded with a haughty and cold tone, as if putting everyone around her in their place, and thoughtfully wondered if anyone in this life could really love her more than the man whose gaze was now riveted on her with undisguised envy. The whole scene was a shock and a mute surprise to the Archduke's young wife, who watched with alarm and uncertainty, trying to understand the hidden motives and intense emotions playing out right before her eyes. Archduke Terdeo Dane Leferion, as if holding back a storm within himself, remained cold and silent, but on his face there was a rage so strong and deep that it could almost burn everything around, foreshadowing the coming changes and conflicts. Upset and holding back tears, the princess firmly and sincerely declared that she could not and would never be able to live without him, because he was the meaning of her whole life, her support, and the only light in dark and lonely days filled with pain and longing. Holding back the jealousy that was exploding within her, she said with an invisible tremor in her voice that the Duke, being a truly noble man, was obliged to fulfill his duty of honor, and, as is proper, to certainly take her hand and bind their destinies with indissoluble bonds of marriage. Lafirion Ferishati, not having time to suppress the gasp of astonishment that flared up, instinctively covered his trembling lips with his hands as soon as the bold statement of the heir to the throne reached his ears, sounding like a thunderclap in the silence of the majestic hall. Suddenly, as if a red-hot iron had touched her heart, Ina Castor, raising a trembling finger towards her rival, broke into a piercing scream, insisting that it was not fitting for her to be in this sacred place for even a moment in the presence of the public. The tense argument between the two ladies, shining like red-hot gold, was suddenly interrupted by an unfamiliar but commanding voice, causing them to freeze and, like marble statues, stand face to face, hiding unspoken words and blinding sparks of anger in their chests. Before them stood a stunningly graceful aristocrat with fiery hair, shimmering like fire in the rays of the chandeliers, and, at the same time, bowing her graceful head in a flawless bow, she greeted the princess like the best actress of a majestic court scene. The woman was strikingly beautiful. Her scarlet hair, like blazing flames in the wind, shimmered in the light of the hall, and her equally scarlet piercing eyes looked boldly when she asked with caustic playfulness how many more women would dare to harass the Duke, who, to everyone's knowledge, had long been tied by the bonds of marriage. Every word she said sounded extremely direct and blunt. There was no lie or fear in her voice, only a sincere, almost carefree mockery, subtly emphasized by a light but expressive smile, as if she knew something that others did not. The princess suddenly felt awkward and anxious when a crowd of courtiers, surrounding her from different sides, began to indignantly express their displeasure, condemning her for her shameless display of feelings for a man who had long been bound by the sacred bonds of marriage. At this point, maintaining politeness and noble restraint, Terdeo Danae Lafirion bowed lightly and with practiced grace before the princess, and with dignity declared that it was time for him and his beloved wife to leave so as not to disturb the peace of the celebration. When they had already begun to move away, slowly leaving the hall under the gaze of the astonished public, the heiress to the throne angrily whispered behind their backs that the Duke would still belong to her, and she would certainly prove that it was her love that he had always been worthy of. At the princess's angry, maddened words, Ferishati turned around with lightning speed, as if pierced by an invisible blade, and threw a look in her direction, filled with icy contempt, anxiety, and bitterness, as if trying to see a person who was not of high birth. Even those who had previously preferred to remain silent and not interfere in palace intrigues could no longer close their eyes to the obvious. The heir to the throne was seized by a mad obsession with the Duke. Her love had lost its nobility and turned into a destructive, manic lust, threatening to destroy everything in its path. The woman's face remained surprisingly empty and detached, like a carefully carved mask, but in the depths of her eyes lurked a tormenting, almost painful thirst to be noticed by that very nobleman to whom she, as to the light, was drawn with all her soul. On this clear, cloudless day, the sky stretched above the earth in a transparent and enchanting crystal height, painted in soft azure tones, through which the soft rays of the sun slowly poured onto everything around, bringing peace and the promise of serenity. The carriage rolled slowly along a trampled forest road, surrounded by majestic trees, whose crowns were tightly intertwined above their heads, casting a cool shadow, and on the sides, like shadows of the past, knights rode on proud war horses, peering attentively into the thicket. In a spacious, richly decorated carriage, slowly rolling along a forest road, sat three people: an aristocrat with fiery, scarlet hair, like molten gold, a duke with a motionless expression on his face, and his refined wife, radiating calm restraint. With a soft, slightly hesitant smile, behind which a slight excitement was hidden, one of the ladies, a young noblewoman with delicate features, sincerely thanked her companion for the help she had provided, trying to express her gratitude not only with words, but with her whole appearance, because it was not just the action that touched her. But before anyone could answer, the man suddenly calmly, and without a shadow of a doubt in his voice, declared that the woman who was being thanked was in fact his own sister. And at that moment, Farashati, overcome with shock, froze, unable to utter a word, with a cold, distant look, as if the boundary between them had been burned out by fire. The girl laconically confirmed that she was indeed the Duke's sister, and, slightly bowing her head, introduced herself by name, the charming and beautiful Circia. With her graceful hands folded in front of her and her gaze slightly lowered, the beautiful scarlet-haired stranger awkwardly greeted the lady, after which, with a quiet but firm determination, she confirmed that she indeed bore the ancient curse of their family, and no force had yet been able to break it. To the cold, reproachful, and bitter words about why she dared to marry the brother of the one who now looked at her with pain, anger, and silent despair, the girl suddenly fell silent, as if something inside her had snapped, destroying all her strength to justify herself and leaving only silence. With his head down and his breathing heavy, Terdeo Dane Lafirion broke the tense silence by calmly saying that their feelings had flared up at first sight, and everything that had happened since was the result of a love that they had been powerless to stop. This outraged the lady, and with a sarcastic grin, Sergia asked in bewilderment whether he really thought she would believe such a ridiculous story, as if testing her mind for strength and ridiculing any possibility of trusting the words coming from her brother. Sitting opposite her husband's sister, the girl rubbed her palms awkwardly, feeling horror run through her entire body like cold needles, listening to the harsh, full of anger and caustic reproaches tirade that sounded from Sergia's lips like a sharp blade, wounding the heart and soul. The veins in Sergia's neck bulged with tension and rage as she stated that her brother had married her solely by order of the emperor, and the thought deeply outraged and humiliated her, filling her heart with poisoned venom and a burning desire to expose all the insidious lies and deceit hidden behind the facade. Farashati looked at her husband with hope, expecting him to dare to object to his sister, to say something in his own defense or hers, but he remained silent, as if he was allowing Circe's words to hurt her and wound her soul, without resisting or taking her side. The air around her suddenly became heavy, and she felt so sick that her hands clenched into tight fists, and a cold sweat broke out on her forehead, like a harbinger of an approaching storm, engulfing her mind and body with an agonizing feeling of weakness and anxiety that she could not overcome. Circe, with her arms folded across her chest, continued to angrily insist on her own. Her rage did not subside, like a flame that was growing stronger with every second, and she was ready to explode from the accumulated indignation, holding back a storm of anger and deep resentment within herself. Suddenly, Farashati leaned her whole body and tried to open the carriage window, her hands trembling with tension, and her heart beating quickly, as if she was looking for even the slightest opportunity to break free from this heavy and suffocating confinement. However, suddenly, the carriage shook violently, as if the ground had shaken under her feet, and she lost her balance, falling on the Duke, accidentally hitting him with her body, which caused confusion and even more tension between them, intensifying the whole situation. The man cast a bitter and angry look at her, full of resentment and hidden indignation, as if all the deepest feelings of disappointment and suppressed rage that he had long held in the depths of his soul, unable to tolerate silence and inaction any longer, were merging in it. While the lady was apologizing to her husband, his sister, standing opposite, suddenly burst out laughing, holding back her laughter with all her might, her body trembling slightly from suppressed merriment, and her eyes sparkling with a living fire, which she tried to hide behind a wide smile covered by her hand. She was shaking all over with laughter, and the slight smile hidden behind her hand only increased the feeling of her secret pleasure, as if she knew something very funny and unexpected that made her react cheerfully to what was happening, remaining aloof from all the seriousness of the moment. The newlyweds froze in shock, hearing someone else's loud and unexpected laughter, which seemed to tear away the curtain of tension and added an unusual shade of awkwardness and confusion to the atmosphere. causing everyone present to instantly become wary and think about the reasons for such laughter. Circe laughed loudly, without holding back, and screamed at the top of her voice that her brother looked so stupid and funny at that moment that it was impossible not to laugh at his ridiculous attempts to impress, causing a real explosion of laughter in everyone around. After this, the aristocrat, wiping away tears of laughter and relief, suddenly announced that he had had a really funny day, full of funny and absurd situations that would now become favorite memories, and a reason for cheerful conversations. The carriage rolled slowly through the dense forest, when the sun had already begun to sink below the horizon, painting the sunset in golden pink hues, and the road ahead seemed like an endless ribbon leading them to a new, unknown, and full of secrets path. The sunset slowly sank behind the horizon, painting the sky in warm shades, and around rose majestic houses and ancient mansions, which seemed to hold within themselves age-old secrets and stories of the past, filling the air with the mysterious atmosphere of a bygone era. The Duke's house was a huge palace, painted snow-white with blue roofs. Many floors and majestic windows created the impression of an impregnable fortress, reflecting the power and status of the owner, making everyone who looked at it feel its grandeur and importance. Farasati, looking out the carriage window, could not hide her admiration, watching her husband's huge mansion, which towered before her with such pride and beauty that her heart was filled with pride and awe before the greatness and status that had now become a part of her life. Suddenly, a knight approached the carriage and announced loudly at the entrance that they had already arrived, but could not enter the courtyard because of a large crowd at the entrance gate, which blocked the way, forcing everyone to wait and contemplate the situation with tension and impatience. Suddenly, the Duke announced loudly and solemnly that his son had returned, and these words instantly filled the air around with excitement and tension, as if a new chapter in the family's destiny was being revealed to those gathered, promising to change everything familiar and ordinary. Farasati turned her gaze towards the gate with surprise and keen interest, because rumors and stories about the boy, whose name was often heard in secret conversations, had long attracted her attention as something mysterious and fateful, capable of influencing the future of the family and her own life. Selfius Sultan Lafirian. That was the name of the young gentleman, and his name sounded with respect and some awe, because he was known for his rare charisma and unusual abilities, which made him a figure that attracted the attention of everyone around him. The boy himself stood opposite the adult man, sternly and silently, as if expecting something important, showing neither fear nor excitement, but radiating an inner strength and confidence that made everyone around him hold their breath and carefully watch his every move. The Duke slowly stepped out of the carriage and walked confidently towards his son, as if preparing for an important meeting on which much depended, and those around him watched with bated breath every step he took, filled with determination and anticipation. Farasati frowned, lowered her head down, and thoughtfully pressed her lips together, experiencing inner uneasiness and anxiety, because in her soul a premonition was growing that this meeting could lead to unexpected and, possibly, undesirable changes in their lives. The man stood motionless, his fists clenched at his sides, his face sullen and focused, reflecting the depth of suppressed emotions and internal struggle that he tried to hide from those around him, not wanting to show weakness or doubt. It turned out to be the maiden's former lover, a man from her past who, without an invitation, tried to enter the mansion and see her, despite the prohibitions and obstacles, as if wanting to restore a lost relationship or rekindle old feelings that should have long been left in the past. Young Selfius Sultan Lafirian responded to the stranger with a mocking and topical tone that there was absolutely no place for such scum as he, making it clear that his appearance was unwelcome and would only cause trouble for everyone around him. However, the man did not pay attention to the boy's harsh words and calmly walked past him, quietly saying that he came here specifically to see Farasati, and no prohibitions or obstacles would stop him in this intention, demonstrating stubbornness and determination to achieve his goal. The boy frowned and firmly decided that he would not allow the adult to go any further, not intending to give in even one step, because in his eyes there was a determined flame that left no doubt about his intentions to protect what was dear to him. Suddenly, Selfius Sultan Lafirian abruptly grabbed his sword and rushed forward to stop the man, demonstrating not only bravery, but also a desire to protect the mansion and Farashati from unwanted intrusion, ready to do anything for his goal. The boy, clutching the sword tightly in his hands, said with unwavering firmness that if the stranger truly desired death and did not heed his warning, then he would definitely get it, showing an uncompromising determination to protect his loved ones at any cost. Suddenly, a strong and determined hand grabbed his hand, preventing him from striking, stopping him from acting rashly and hastily, demonstrating care and control to prevent unnecessary cruelty and maintain at least a small amount of calm in this tense situation. The guest, who had come to their house so brazenly and daringly, smiled mockingly and with confidence in his voice, as if testing the patience of everyone present, and the boy, realizing that the situation was getting out of control, decisively stopped his resistance, resigning himself to the circumstances. Farashati, his former lover, suddenly appeared before the guest, her face expressing anger and cold disappointment, and she looked at him with such contempt that even the boldest words seemed powerless against her deep sense of resentment and pain. To every word the guy said, she gave a clear and decisive answer that she had long ago and irrevocably stopped loving him, and these words, like a cold knife, pierced his heart, causing a storm of anger and confusion in the man from the sudden and complete change of feelings. Enraged and stunned by such a confession, the man shouted loudly, accusing her of falling out of love with him too suddenly and quickly, leaving no chance for an explanation or reconciliation, which only increased the tension between them. The lady frowned and stared at him with a cold gaze, showing her inner alienation, and behind her stood her husband, who looked attentively and suspiciously at the intrusive and unwanted guest, as if evaluating his every movement and intention. Suddenly, the guest with damp, sweaty hands said confidently and loudly that the rank-and-file soldiers had already gathered in formation to organize and lead the procession before the start of a very important and solemn event, adding tension and anticipation to the atmosphere of upcoming events. He offered to go with him and then stand quietly nearby, waiting for her answer, to which the lady, with obvious bewilderment and slight irony, asked again whether he really seriously believed that after everything that had happened, she was ready to go with him voluntarily. Terdeo Dene Lafirion, looking at his wife with firmness and steadfastness in his eyes, firmly told her that she was not at all obliged to listen or give in to the words of that night, since by his personal order, anyone who created obstacles or inconveniences would be immediately thrown out of the gate without any discussion. The man shuddered sharply and frowned, feeling the coldness and ruthlessness in the voice of his former lover, when she, without a shadow of a doubt or hesitation, declared that if he decided to continue to interfere in their affairs, he would be immediately, as an unwanted guest, simply removed, without allowing even the slightest resistance or protest. The guards instantly grabbed the guy by the arms, squeezed them tightly, and dragged him towards the exit of the hall, while he, despite the pressure and restrictions, shouted to his ex that he would definitely wait for her and would not leave her alone, filling the air with threat and tension. Meanwhile, Farashati herself, confidently holding her new family by the hands, calmly and decisively walked away, leaving behind the whole storm of emotions and conflicts, as if closing the door on the past and opening a new chapter of her life, full of hope and change. Sweat slowly rolled down the girl's damp face, and deep down, she quietly thought about how recklessly and rashly her ex had acted, shouting such harsh and painful words, as if he did not realize the full gravity of his threats and the possible consequences that they could cause in the future. At this point, Farashati's new husband, looking at her attentively and seriously, quietly and carefully asked if the man she was talking about really posed such a real danger that he could cause her mortal harm in the future, making her think seriously. Farashati, feeling beads of sweat running down her face, slowly and thoughtfully spoke words that reflected her inner fears, anxieties, and doubts, as if trying to find in them support and hope for protection and support next to her new spouse, so as to never feel vulnerable again. The evening twilight slowly fell on the windows and balcony of their room. The soft light of the setting sun broke through the translucent curtains, painting the walls in golden orange tones, and a deep, ringing silence hung in the room, broken only by the light rustle of the wind from the street and the creaking of the floorboards. For the second hour already, Farashati sat alone at the poor wooden table, her head down sadly and not touching her food, while her husband was having an important and protracted conversation with their son, staying longer than usual and leaving his wife in anxious, thought-filled solitude. The girl, who had not expected that her past would catch up with her so quickly and so persistently, looked hunched over the cold food, thinking that her former lover would haunt her even now, after a legal marriage, not wanting to let her go either from his thoughts or from his life, as if trying to return what was lost. She was afraid that now that the truth about her past and previous feelings would come to light, the Duke's family might begin to treat her coldly, distantly, or even hostilely, doubting her sincerity, dignity, and intentions, which caused her inner anxiety, shame, and an almost devastating sense of guilt. When the butler, in a restrained but solemn voice, introduced the new Duchess to all the service personnel standing along the walls, waiting to be greeted, many of them immediately began to whisper among themselves, casting appraising glances and sharing cautious guesses about her past and origins. The Duke's son, standing a little behind, visibly flinched and looked frightened when his father suddenly grabbed his hand, as if wanting to hold him back or warn him against unnecessary words. And in this tense gesture, one could read much more than just concern, more like a warning. Meanwhile, the lady herself, maintaining an outward calm, absent-mindedly and almost mechanically stirred the soup in her plate with a spoon, without touching the food and demonstrating that her thoughts were far away from here, completely absorbed by internal tension and growing anxiety. She winced at the loud noise coming from the next wing of the mansion, and pressed her lips together, thinking that her husband's family, despite their outward sternness and splendor, certainly kept too many secrets that could surface at any moment and destroy the fragile balance of her new position. Finally, after a long wait and some anxious thoughts, her new husband, the Duke of Turdeo Dane Leferian, came to dinner with his butler, whose presence immediately filled the room with a reserved grandeur and a cold authority hidden behind his silent gaze. Almost weightlessly, like the shadow of an evening breeze, he sat down next to his wife, silently, limiting himself to a polite nod, as if they had long been connected by a silent, viscous mutual understanding. Or, on the contrary, there was a bottomless abyss of silence, cold and ringing. With a hint of slight alarm and bewilderment in her voice, Farashati inquired about the whereabouts of his son, for it seemed strange to her that the boy had missed dinner, especially on such a solemn evening when the whole family was obliged to gather at the common table. Without taking his eyes off the invisible point, he made a dry remark about the boy refusing to eat dinner, and, allowing irritation to creep into his voice, he noted, as if by chance, that he was again being capricious or worried, recalling the events of the past day. Farashati soon received an answer, devoid of any solemnity. The boy was 9 years old, and although the fact seemed indisputable, it only gave rise to more doubts and strange forebodings in her, as if there was something unsaid hidden behind this number. When asked directly whether the boy was really the Duke's biological son, Terdeo Dane Leferion did not answer a word, but merely lowered his gaze to the floor, wearily remaining silent, like a man who was driven into a corner not by fatigue, but by something heavier, the truth. Although the child's age seemed strange and too mature to be the son of a duke, especially given the circumstances, the boy's appearance was strikingly reminiscent of Terdeo. In his facial features, the expression in his eyes, his gestures, like a reflection in a belated mirror. Terdeo Dane Leferion suddenly spoke with unexpected firmness and clarity, saying that since she, a respected lady of his house, had become a full-fledged part of their family, she could not remain in ignorance and was obliged to learn the whole truth, no matter how difficult and bitter it actually turned out to be. Surprised, shocked, and slightly confused, Farashati froze when she learned that the boy she had mistakenly believed to be the Duke's son was in fact his own brother's son. A revelation that hit her like a sudden winter squall, sweeping away all her previous beliefs and hopes. Immediately, as if a wave of shame, remorse, and inner turmoil had washed over her, Farashati blushed deeply, remembering her previous dark suspicions and hasty conclusions, which now seemed to her cruel, shameful, and unfair to the very depths of her soul. With a slight, almost apologetic smile and a tremor in her voice, she began to question her husband in a restrained manner, wanting to understand where his brother was now, why he was not nearby, where he had disappeared without a trace, and what was the fatal reason that the boy was left to grow up under the care of the Duke, like a forgotten member of the family. The aristocrat's gaze suddenly dimmed, darkened by deep pain and bitterness, as he explained, with a heavy voice, that his brother, the boy's father, had passed away long ago, leaving behind a void that the entire family suffered from, like a wound that would never heal. Farashati stood frozen in a daze, absorbed in the touching and at the same time heartbreaking story where the boy's father died, and the mother, unable to bear the terrible pain and greater fear, ran away, abandoning the child to his fate, as if forgetting about him forever. Her hands were suddenly covered in a sticky cold sweat. Her heart began to beat with inexorable force, overcome by painful sympathy and a feeling of helplessness, as if she herself was experiencing the loss and loneliness that squeezed the boy's chest without mercy. Finally, the man, with a heavy weariness in his eyes, reassured Farashati, telling her that the boy would soon be sent out of town to a secluded and protected place where he would be cared for and surrounded by warmth, and therefore she should not worry and allow fears to take hold of her heart unnecessarily. The girl felt so uncomfortable in the guy's company that she quickly stood up from the cleared table, apologized for her unexpected behavior, and, having collected her thoughts, announced that she would leave this social event first, so as not to create any inconvenience. The noblewoman left the hall, carefully closing the door behind her, after which, with slight pride and determination, she declared to the servants that she knew the way to her chambers perfectly well and could manage without outside help, as if asserting her right to independence. The staircase was covered with a soft and velvety blue carpet, which quietly muffled the steps, creating a feeling of comfort and nobility. But despite this, the girl had been trying in vain for several hours to find the way to her chambers, slowly ascending and descending the steps. For hours now, as if in a lost labyrinth, she had been trying to find the right path to her chambers, wandering along the stairs with a blue carpet that seemed endless, and her every movement was filled with slight anxiety and confusion. Suddenly, stopping at one of the doors, the girl noticed a maid who stood motionless and silent, as if expecting something important or keeping some secret within herself, which further increased her feeling of uncertainty and anxiety in front of the unknown. The maid, holding a dimly flickering lantern in her hands, froze in place, hearing her mistress's unexpected question about the reasons for her presence here, and for a moment there was a flash of confusion and indecision in her eyes, as if she realized the full importance of the moment. After a short pause, the maid bowed gracefully, as if saluting the newly minted mistress of the house, and solemnly greeted her, uttering words of respect and recognition, thereby opening the doors to a new stage in the life of the Duchess and her presence within the walls of this estate. As it turned out late in the evening, the obliging and always efficient maid, walking along the mosaic corridor of the ancient palace, brought dinner to the young heir on a silver tray. But he, immersed in anxious thoughts, stubbornly did not open the heavy carved doors for her. Farashati immediately realized that the majestic Selfius Sultan La Furion, usually proud and imperturbable, was now sullen, for he must have been forced to listen to his father's harsh reproaches for long, exhausting hours, which fell on him like a heavy, almost unbearable burden. She clearly remembered how, intertwining her fingers with her new husband, she walked along the moonlit alley of the old garden, and in front of her, his thoughtful son and faithful knight stepped majestically and measuredly, as if unfolding before them a shining road into the future, full of secret hopes. Then Selfius Sultan Lafurian, embarrassed to the depths of his tormented soul, walked along the marble corridor, his head down and his thin lips pressed into a narrow line, as if wishing to hide from the courtiers the inner storm of feelings that was seething in his heart and did not give him the slightest peace. Without thinking twice and relying on a sudden burst of sympathy, Farashati, with firm confidence and slight irritation, declared that she would personally take the dinner to the young boy. And the confused maid, bowing her head and not daring to contradict, silently left, leaving the tray in her hands. Inside the spacious room, immersed in the semi-darkness of evening shadows and silence, the boy, with his head covered with a light, almost transparent sheet on a wide bed with a carved headboard, sat quietly, sad, and unable to drive away the feeling of loneliness, anxiety, and deep resentment that squeezed his heart. Suddenly, without knocking or warning, someone cautiously entered the child's cozy room, and at that anxious moment the boy, catching the rustle of soft steps on the carpet, shuddered with his whole body, clutching the sheet tighter, as if hoping to hide from the whole world under its thin, slightly trembling fabric. He was about to shout out in irritation who dared to enter his room without any permission, violating his privacy, peace, and right to personal space, when suddenly, taken aback, he recognized in the silhouette at the door his new stepmother, the very woman with whom his powerful father had recently married. With great pomp and official speeches, Selfius Sultan Lafirian froze, staring from under the soft, protective blanket at the unexpected guest, not understanding what she was doing there. Why exactly now, in the darkest and quietest part of the coming evening, she decided to disturb his solitude with her unexpected, and, as it seemed to him, inappropriate presence. Outside the window, behind the thin lace of the old curtains, the viscous darkness of the night was thickening, and the branches of the trees, bending in the wind, creaking and scratching the glass, whispered anxious songs, as if the castle itself had frozen in anxious anticipation of what would happen between this strange, imperfect couple, the boy and his stepmother, sitting down carefully on the edge of the wide, soft bed next to her new adopted son. Farashati quietly, but with sincere warmth in her voice, introduced herself to him, trying to speak softly, affectionately, and politely, as if she was afraid to scare off this fragile, strained to the limit moment of the first awkward acquaintance. Selfius Sultan Lafirion said with bitterness, distrust, and barely restrained tears that the girl was probably trying with all her might to appear good and caring, only in order to later, at a convenient opportunity, earn the approval and praise of the Duke. After that, slightly squinting and curling his lips into a sarcastic grin, the boy said with obvious mockery and cold mockery in his voice that in her place he would not have dared to even come close to this room, let alone sit on his bed. Rising from his bed with a confident and abrupt movement, Selfius Sultan Lafirian, restrainedly, but firmly, and with a hint of irritation in his voice, ordered the young maiden to immediately leave his personal space, declaring that her hypocritical presence here was extremely annoying to him. Despite all his bravado, arrogant tone, and desire to appear strong and unapproachable, it was clearly visible that tears had literally just recently been running down the young man's face, leaving thin, treacherous tracks on his cheeks and revealing his pain, which he was trying with all his might to hide. The lady, despite his cold, harsh, and absolutely unfriendly words, was in no hurry to leave the room, and, maintaining a gentle expression on her face, slowly, with barely noticeable tenderness and care, brought her graceful hand to the young man's face to carefully wipe away the invisible, but still warm and treacherous traces of tears. Selfius Sultan Lafirion shuddered involuntarily when the girl's fingers almost touched his sensitive skin, as if the very touch of someone else's warmth caused him to feel acute fear, uncertainty, and an instinctive desire to distance himself, to hide in a shell of contempt, coldness, and causticity. Farashati, suddenly realizing that her gesture was perceived with alarm, caution, and misunderstanding, awkwardly froze with her hand raised in the air, as if petrified in the moment, because she did not want to cause the young man any pain, or offense, or anxiety, just a little comfort, care, and simple warmth. When the boy suddenly began to tremble, his thin shoulders shaking from internal tension, fear, and suppressed emotions, the girl, embarrassed and noticeably worried, hastily apologized to him in a quiet, almost whispering voice, in which one could feel sincere confusion. But suddenly, without waiting for an answer, and as if seized by a sudden inner impulse, the boy abruptly extended his hand, grabbed the hem of her long, heavy green dress, and without saying a word, unexpectedly and abruptly pulled her along with him, as if a contradictory, painful desire had flared up in him not to let her go. Not understanding at all where exactly this stubborn and gloomy boy could lead her, Farashati, with slight anxiety in her voice and inner confusion, tried to stop him, quietly asking him to stop and explain what he was going to do with her at this difficult and confusing moment. But after just a couple of minutes, without further ado, and with a clearly darkened and gloomy expression on his face, he, with unexpected rudeness and cold persistence, literally pushed her out the door, trying not to even look her in the eye, as if she were a stranger and a completely unwelcome guest here. After this, without raising his head and looking somewhere past, Selfius Sultan Leferian coldly, distantly, and almost indifferently said that she should not even try to pretend to be interested in his person in the future. He did not need false participation and superficial pity or sympathy. Surprised, confused, and as if slightly struck by his words, Farashati stepped back, took a few hesitant steps back, continuing to look towards the closed door, not expecting such harshness, cold rejection, and obvious hostility from her young relative. There, in a semi-dark corridor, with dim and flickering lighting, she was finally found by a worried maid, who ran up and said that she had been looking for her young mistress for quite some time, since she had suddenly disappeared from the sight of all the servants in the house, without any warning or explanation. Bowing their heads in respect, and at the same time with a slight trepidation, they announced to the lady that today was her first wedding night with the Duke, and therefore they had prepared refreshing and fragrant water for her in advance, so that she could refresh herself and feel comfortable after the important event. Shocked and completely overcome with embarrassment, Farashati froze in place, her eyes wide open, her cheeks covered with a delicate blush, and she suddenly remembered that she had completely forgotten about such an important and exciting event that had just happened in her life. The noblewoman stood motionless, dressed in a light and elegant white dress, right next to the huge doors in the long, quiet corridor, as if trying to collect her thoughts in order to accept and understand the seriousness and unusualness of what had happened. With her arms neatly folded across her chest, one palm pressed to her mouth, in a gesture of thoughtfulness and doubt, she hoped and sincerely believed that the Duke was not at all interested in women, and that she would not have a real wedding night with him at all, leaving it only in dreams and guesses. Suddenly, the massive doors slowly swung open, and the Duke himself emerged from them, a majestic and handsome man in only a light shirt, with his hair damp from the water, whose piercing gaze immediately stopped on her, expressing unexpected surprise and slight confusion at that very moment. The lady hesitated, feeling her heart beat faster when she saw that the man was genuinely surprised by her sudden appearance, and clearly did not expect such a visit at such a late hour, which made her momentarily confused and lose her composure. Covering her face with a trembling hand to hide the mixed feelings of embarrassment and confusion, Farashati quietly began to retreat, muttering through suppressed tears that she was going to leave and try to find another free room for some quiet rest and privacy on this difficult evening. However, the young man did not allow her to leave quietly. He crept up behind her unnoticed, deftly grabbed her hand, and calmly but firmly asked where exactly she was going to go now, as if warning her that no one should leave without his knowledge and consent at this important moment. The aristocrat calmly and with a slight smile explained that in the future, after their divorce, the emperor, seeing how he would yearn for Farashati, would not at all prevent him from marrying the princess, allowing everyone to follow their own path and happiness without offense or obstacles. Then, covering her face with her hands and trying to hide her tears, the lady had difficulty realizing that they would have to live together in the same room every night, which caused her mixed feelings of fear and embarrassment before the unknown future and close coexistence. The young man began to undress slowly, trying to calm his companion, quietly saying that he would not allow rumors to spread, and would not violate her personal boundaries, promising a careful and respectful attitude towards her, despite all the difficulties of their situation. Ferishati, with a tired voice, said that she would just lie down and sleep on the sofa, trying to keep her distance, to which Terdeo Dane Lafirian replied with a slight grin that she could do whatever she wanted, because in this house the rules belonged to both of them, and a compromise was inevitable. After that, the man slowly took off his gloves, looked closely at Ferishati, and carefully recommended that they spend this night together in the same bed, explaining that tomorrow it would be difficult for them to hide from prying eyes and maintain at least a drop of privacy in this house. However, suddenly, the noblewoman realized that the guy did not take off his gloves at all, but on the contrary, he put them on even at night, so as not to accidentally poison or harm anyone, because this habit was like invisible armor and protection from accidental troubles for him. And so, finally, the newlyweds, tired from the long day and all the worries, quietly lay down together on the wide bed to fall asleep together, feeling close to each other, despite all the terrible fears and uncertainty that hung over their future. No matter how hard Ferishati tried to find peace and fall asleep in the silence of the night, her thoughts stubbornly returned to obsessive, disturbing images, forcing her toss and turn incessantly, as if her mind did not want to let go of anxiety and allow her body to plunge into long-awaited sleep. Suddenly, the noblewoman started and turned around when she heard her husband speak quietly to her, as if trying to gently bring her attention back and comfort her in this heavy sleeplessness, showing care and tenderness in the simplest words that she so desperately needed to hear. He himself, even while in bed, did not stop carefully sorting through the documents, being busy with important matters that could not wait, and this showed his constant employment and responsibility, despite all the personal difficulties that they both had to face at that moment. How suddenly he confessed that the senior title of Duke by right should belong not to him at all, but to his sister, since she was the true heir, but because of the terrible curse that had engulfed their family and plunged it into madness, the title had passed to him unfairly. Ferishati, overcome with deep shock, listened with indescribable anxiety as she was told the bitter truth that a woman, cursed by fate, had destroyed the family, plunging it into madness and chaos, and therefore the title had passed to her brother, despite all the traditions and laws of the family. With noticeable sadness and frustration, Terdeo Dane Lafirion finished his story, explaining that his relative, understanding the gravity of the situation and the bitterness of fate, voluntarily renounced the title, passing it on to him in order to preserve family dignity and peace. The man quietly explained that Circia had then reproached him for his coldness and cruelty, not out of malice, but only because she was deeply concerned about his fate and sincerely worried about his future, which made her act in such a way, full of anxiety and doubt. The lady deeply realized and understood that her husband sincerely told her all these intimate and important things not by chance, but because he sincerely worried and cared about her safety and future, trying to share his most intimate experiences and thoughts. The night shadow from the high windows spread softly across the cold floor, like a quiet whisper of time, enveloping the room in a mysterious coolness and creating a deep atmosphere of tranquility in which thoughts and feelings intertwined, making the heart beat slower and deeper. The aristocrat herself, despite her attempts to calm down, felt growing awkwardness and inner turmoil when her husband began to pour out his soul to her right in bed, revealing the most secret thoughts and feelings that he had long hidden from prying eyes. In that quiet moment, lying in the darkness and watching her own hands, she felt fear and doubt that perhaps she had been too hasty in her decision to change the course of her life and destiny towards an unknown future, full of dangers and great trials. Now, having married this young man, she was afraid that her step back into the past might be a mistake, and she wondered painfully whether she had returned to her former position or had boldly entered upon a new, unknown path of destiny. She constantly blamed herself for all the misfortunes, as if she felt how all the looks of those around her pierced her through and through, full of accusations and misunderstanding, and it was these penetrating looks that made her painfully doubt her every decision and action. The lady was deeply afraid that all the coming events and inevitable troubles would again unfold exactly as they had already happened in her painful past, and that the history of bitter mistakes and painful disappointments would certainly repeat itself, bringing new suffering and difficult trials upon her and her loved ones. Most of all, the lady was tormented by the excruciating fear that her choice would turn out to be fatal, erroneous, and unforgivable, that she had put her fate on the line and would now be unable to correct the consequences that would forever change her life and bring only deep pain and severe disappointment. The Grand Duke heard his new wife crying softly into the soft pillow next to her, and the sound broke his heart, making him feel her mental pain and loneliness so keenly, as if he himself were involved in her excruciating suffering and deep sadness. After that, he looked down, filled with deep sympathy and painful sadness, trying to find words of support that could at least slightly ease her mental pain and give her sincere hope for a bright and happy future together. In her tormenting and endless nightmares, the image of her former lover repeatedly appeared, who had betrayed her mercilessly and now mocked her broken heart and mental wounds with a bitter grin, as if enjoying her suffering and bitterness endlessly. Her sweet and seemingly harmless sister, with a cold and mocking mockery in her voice, accused her of allegedly taking away from her the most precious person, her lover, as if enjoying the moment of her pain and humiliation, thereby adding even more torment and unbearable burden to her soul. The stepmother, sparing neither words nor gestures, smothered her with a pillow in a fit of rage, and then, with an arrogant grin and malicious glee, declared that soon she and her sister would take away all her inheritance and deprive her of her last hopes, leaving Farashati in a state of horror and complete hopelessness, as if darkness had swallowed her whole. In horror and despair, Farashati clasped her hands tightly to her chest, trying to protect her broken heart, and, with retreating steps, tried to get away from the painful nightmare, as if trying to escape from the inexorable darkness hanging over her soul and find at least a little peace. The girl was awakened by sudden strange voices, and she, covered in cold sweat, jumped up sharply in fright, trying to understand where she was and what was happening around her in this unfamiliar place, full of mysteries and worries, while her husband lay quietly next to her and carefully and caringly asked if she was okay. Her husband lay next to her, quietly and caringly asking if she was okay after the terrible dream. And the girl, feeling like a stranger in her husband's house, in a new room with unfamiliar furniture and cold walls, tried to calm her breathing, slowly coming to her senses, and trying to feel at least a drop of comfort in this new home for her. She was in her husband's house, in a strange room, surrounded by new furniture and unfamiliar surroundings, which reminded her that this was now her new home, full of mysteries and the unknown, and slowly, breathing deeply, the girl tried to calm down, finding the strength to accept the inevitable changes and a new life next to her husband. Breathing slowly and evenly, the lady gradually calmed down, allowing her heart to find peace and let go of the disturbing thoughts that had previously haunted her, plunging her into a feeling of peace and light hope for the best. Suddenly, footsteps quietly and leisurely entered the room, echoing muffled through the quiet walls, filling the calm space with a slight excitement and unexpected energy that seemed to awaken the lady from her deep thoughts and make her listen carefully to every sound. It was a gray-haired man who entered their room unceremoniously, loudly greeting the Duke with obvious authority and self-confidence, as if he was used to commanding and demanding attention without the slightest respect for those around him, disturbing the peace of the house. The old man began to loudly scold his former ward, accusing him of thoughtless actions and serious mistakes made in his youth, emphasizing that such misdeeds were unacceptable, especially in his presence, where the strictest discipline and order were expected. But then the man suddenly fell silent and stood awkwardly, noticing that the strong Terdeo Dane Leferian was in the company of his sweet wife, sitting with her on the bed, which clearly embarrassed him and caused some confusion, disrupting the usual course of his words. The Duke cast a sharp and stern look at the guest, full of irritation and indignation, while Farashati, in his arms, slowly came to her senses after a painful nightmare, trying to find peace and confidence in this new world for herself. The old man was in complete shock, as if time had stopped, and the maids standing behind him also looked on in confusion, with their eyes wide open and their mouths slightly open, not believing their eyes and what they were hearing, as if an incredible scene was unfolding before them in the house. At that moment, the Duke's son ran up behind them, rushing forward with unpredictable energy, and suddenly hit the old man in the back, shouting loudly that he also wanted to go inside to see what was happening in the house and understand the essence of the important events taking place. However, the young boy was never allowed to enter, being told sternly and firmly that the place was too serious and unsuitable for children's eyes, which only increased his confusion and disappointment, leaving him outside the door in confusion and anticipation. Finally waking up, Farashati turned her anxious gaze to her husband, with a question in her eyes, trying to understand what had really happened and why a tense situation had suddenly flared up in their chambers, making her heart beat faster and harder. Terdeo Dane Lafirion looked down at her calmly and slightly distantly, assessing the situation and her reaction, as if trying to understand whether she realized the gravity of the moment and the consequences of their unexpected situation in which they had been caught, without hiding his thoughts. Farashati winced sharply, finally realizing exactly what an awkward and compromising position they had been caught in, which sent a wave of awkwardness and embarrassment piercing her soul and made her face distort with inner horror and silent shock. The woman's face lit up with horror, as if fear and confusion were battling inside her, and there was a tension in the air, almost palpable, as if the room itself was frozen in anticipation of further events and the reaction of those around her to this truly unexpected and loud incident. A loud, sharp cry that sounded throughout the spacious mansion pierced the silence and filled every corner of the house with anxiety and concern, causing everyone present to freeze in amazement and bewilderment at what was happening without delay. In her haste to escape from her husband's tender embrace, the lady accidentally hit him with her elbow, causing Terdeo Dane Lafirion to suddenly recoil, as if struck by her sudden movement and the emotions that were seething in her soul, not allowing her to remain calm and unperturbed. The morning windows opened wide to welcome the bright day, letting in the soft blue light of the sky, which gently enveloped the space and filled it with peace, despite the inner turmoil raging in Farashati's heart and giving her no peace. Farashati sat at the table, looking down at the floor, as if trying to hide from her own feelings that overwhelmed her and prevented her from concentrating, and her new brown dress seemed to reflect the mixed emotions, anxiety, excitement, and confusion that engulfed her entire body and mind. At that very moment, the old man, who had earlier unceremoniously burst into the room, loudly scolded the Duke right at the table, in the presence of his young wife and little son, with harsh reproaches for the fact that the wedding had been played so suddenly and without warning close people and relatives. Later, the advisor, noticing attentively and with some alarm that something was clearly wrong with the Duke's face, asked with concern and excitement what had happened, since the Duke was soon to go to the imperial palace to perform important state duties and obligations. However, the aristocrat, as if brushing aside all worries, troubles, and unnecessary conversations, coldly rejected all questions and ordered his faithful servant Moulton to immediately prepare a carriage for him so that he could set off on a long and important journey without the slightest delay or fuss. The boy sitting next to him suddenly shuddered and jumped up sharply when his uncle rather abruptly and unexpectedly announced that today he would be sent back to his native villa, which caused the child real anxiety and genuine concern for his future and the fate of the whole family. The man's hand clenched into a tight, tense fist, and through the tension came a sincere, deeply felt apology for the boy's too willful and unexpected interruption of the adult's conversation, while showing great courage and a lively interest in the event taking place. The young man deeply repented for his previous behavior, sincerely asking forgiveness from his relatives for the inconvenience caused, firmly declaring that he intended to stay in this majestic mansion and go nowhere else, as if he felt a connection with this place. Suddenly, Terdeo Dane Lafirion rose sharply from his seat, began to scold his adopted son tensely and angrily, accusing him of the fact that due to his careless actions and deeds, Their carefully hidden family secret could be revealed, which could harm their entire family and position. Selfius Sultan Leferian, his head bowed in deep thought, listened attentively to the stern words of his uncle, who said that if he sincerely repents, then he should simply obey the order given without question and not create unnecessary problems. A tense silence reigned in the hall. The advisors, together with the aristocrat's new wife, silently listened to this conversation between father and son, not daring to interrupt or interfere, as if the weight of understanding and expectation hung in the air, not allowing a single sound to disturb the peace of the room. Suddenly, Selfius Sultan Leferian decided to speak up again, asking his relative, with a slight note of resentment, why he had adopted him at all, if he had originally intended to abandon and throw him away, without giving him the slightest chance of trust or support in this family. The boy, filled with sadness and inner pain, lowered his head, trying to hide the tears that were quietly rolling down his cheeks, bitterly swallowing the pain of betrayal and loneliness, fighting with the surging emotions that almost broke his young soul. The lovely Farashati was surprised to notice, in the words of the sweet young man, that hidden pain and unwillingness to be alone, as if his heart was afraid of emptiness and loneliness, hiding its true feelings behind words filled with subtle sadness and tenderness. The adults in the room watched in silence as Selfius Sultan Leferion, oblivious to everyone around him, slowly and decisively walked out of the room, his footsteps echoing in the silence, as if emphasizing his inner desire to get away from everyone and everything, leaving the sadness behind. Farashati couldn't help but reproach her husband, quietly reminding him that it would be right to talk to the boy after the meal, because he hadn't eaten anything since the previous evening, and an attentive word could soften his mental pain and restore hope for understanding and support. The Duke, coldly and decisively, answered his wife that it was not her concern at all, and not her business to interfere in such matters, as if protecting himself from unnecessary worries and emotions in order to maintain an imperious, unyielding, and strict position in this complex family matter, which required absolute discipline. The man, without stopping for a moment, confidently and decisively walked away, ordering his devoted advisor to show the Duchess, who had only recently arrived at their spacious and majestic estate, all the important and hidden corners, secret passages, and secrets of this large house. Looking closely into Mr. Moulton's eyes, the man sincerely and heartily wished him a successful journey and successful completion of the task, as if expressing hope that all matters would go smoothly and without complications, because a lot for the future of their family depended on it. In the long, bright, and majestic corridor of the mansion stood a lady and an old man, carefully examining the surrounding space. The old man slowly and in detail told and showed her numerous corridors, halls, rooms, and hidden secret places, as if opening the door to a new mysterious world. The man bowed politely to the lady, introducing himself and sincerely apologizing for his rudeness in the morning, explaining that he was simply alarmed and wanted to avoid misunderstandings, thus showing his respect and desire to establish good relations with the new guest. Moulton, with a kind and warm smile on his lips, introduced himself as the Duke's devoted assistant. His gray hair and deep wrinkles on his face spoke of many years of experience and faithful service, which immediately inspired confidence and commanded respect from everyone who met him. Farashati, showing good manners and respect for traditions, also bowed politely in response, asking that she be looked after properly and with all the requirements of etiquette, because it was important for her to feel comfortable and dignified in a new environment and with new acquaintances. The man, not wanting to scold himself anymore for his previous imprudent behavior towards her, calmly accepted the situation, and she, noticing his embarrassment, waved her hands and smiled, assuring him that everything was fine and there was no reason for great concern. The girl, having barely heard the quiet but confident words that she should address the gray-haired advisor without unnecessary formalities, because from now on he was officially under her command, froze in slight embarrassment, not knowing how to act correctly and what to say. Moulton, wanting to support his new mistress and dispel the awkward silence, straightened his shoulders, bowed his gray head in greeting, and gave her a warm, reassuring smile that radiated respect, loyalty, and a willingness to serve impeccably at all times. Sweet Farashati, feeling how an attentive and benevolent gaze was directed at her, suddenly felt how a hot wave of embarrassment rolled over her cheeks, spreading a thick scarlet blush from her eyelashes to her neck, betraying her sincere excitement and tenderness. The man, with dignity and polite diligence, began to slowly lead the young lady around the entire vast and luxurious estate, opening the doors to spacious halls, majestic galleries, and cozy rooms, explaining in detail what was where, what this or that hall was for. When Farashati, carefully lifting the hem of her dress and casting curious glances around, inquired with interest where her husband was at that hour, Moulton, without slowing down and maintaining a respectful tone, calmly explained that the Duke had urgently left for a planned meeting with the Empress. The lady, however, interrupted him gently but firmly, making it clear that this was not what she was interested in, and with an anxious earnestness that sounded like real pain, asked whether the Duke really had such a clear and alarming dislike for his adopted son, Selfius Sultan Lafirion. The men's footsteps immediately became less frequent, echoing muffledly along the corridor, and soon stopped altogether on the cool marble tiles, reflecting the reflections of the morning light. And Moulton, frowning and slightly biting his lip, turned his head slightly, as if not daring to immediately answer such a painful question. Moulton, looking away and turning his back to the young lady, said in a restrained voice that the Duke did not at all hate the adopted boy, but only distanced himself from him over time, allowing his own doubts and duty to overshadow his feelings. Standing motionless by the window, the man, with difficulty choosing his words, explained that he had long and faithfully served the Lafirian house, knew a lot about their family's past, and therefore could judge the intricacies of the Duke's relationship with his adopted son, not by rumors, but by experience and long-standing observations. Having listened carefully to everything, Farashati nodded sadly, agreeing that she too was aware of the family secret that generations of the Lafirian clan had been hiding, and although she did not yet know everything, she already felt how much pain and loneliness permeated the destinies of those who were connected by this blood. Selfius Sultan Lafirian, unlike other children of his age and position, carried a rare and dangerous poison in his body from birth, which is why any strong emotions, fears, or worries resonated not only in his heart, but also in his body, with physical, sometimes unbearable pain. With restraint and attention, without interrupting, Farashati listened to Moulton's explanation that it was for this very reason that the Duke had decided to send the boy to the village, away from the city palaces and unnecessary attention, so that he would not encounter irritating factors and could maintain inner balance. The old man smiled softly, almost paternally, at the young lady, as if wishing to dispel her inner anxiety and worry, and quietly said that she should not worry too much about such a delicate topic, because external impressions can deceive. He laughed softly, looking warmly towards the huge window, and with subtle irony in his voice added that Duke Lafirian, alas, had not been inclined to show warm feelings since his youth. His care was more reminiscent of gloomy severity or cold restraint. They continued down a long marble corridor, where tall windows cast glare on the exquisite moldings and heavy curtains, when Moulton turned his head and calmly announced that their path lay further in the direction of the old ducal garden. Meanwhile, the lady, despite the change of scenery, the warm voice of her companion, and her attempts to concentrate on the beauty around her, could not get the image of the saddened boy out of her head, who had previously locked himself in his room, silently crying, holding back despair and pain. Walking forward along the long corridor, she could not understand why her great and powerful husband, the Duke, could not break down the walls of misunderstanding and disagreement, could not find the words to calm the boy and explain to him everything that was so important and necessary. Suddenly, Farashati turned around sharply, hearing a loud and piercing cry coming from the water, as if someone had unexpectedly fallen and hit themselves, causing her heart to freeze from the sudden anxiety and vague fear that engulfed her entire being at that moment. Above, as if struck by lightning, the servants and nobles stood frozen like statues, with their hands raised and frozen, their eyes filled with confusion and anxiety, because no one could immediately understand what exactly had happened at this unexpected and disturbing moment in time. After a short pause, they hastened to explain to the lady that Selfius Sultan Lafirion had accidentally injured his hand, as a result of which he was now forced to remain in his room where he accepted help from strangers, which for such a proud young man was a rare and unusual situation. The lady stood frozen in complete shock, as if numb, at the very moment when the advisor firmly and insistently ordered that the Duke be contacted immediately so that he could return as soon as possible and provide the necessary assistance to his son, without leaving the situation without due control and attention. Frowning, Farashati resolutely and with genuine firmness in her voice told the advisor that there was no need to turn to anyone or call for help. She herself would definitely go and provide the boy with all the necessary and professional medical care. Moulton replied sullenly and seriously that such actions would be absolutely unacceptable and extremely dangerous for her personally, reminding her that the young master's blood was poisoned, which significantly complicates the whole situation and requires extreme caution and thoughtfulness. However, the lady did not lose her head, and with firmness and confidence in her voice, reminded that she was already well aware of this circumstance, and the curse associated with the blood of the young aristocrat did not in any way affect her determination to help and protect the boy with all possible forces and means. After much thought and internal struggle, Farashati firmly, and with obvious determination, declared that in this huge castle, at the moment, there was not a single other person left who could provide the necessary assistance to the poor boy. Therefore, she was obliged to take full responsibility upon herself without the slightest hesitation. With a heavy heart and full of readiness, the noblewoman entered the spacious and slightly darkened room, carrying in her hands a large and carefully packed box of medicines, after which she quietly approached the bed where Selfius Sultan Lafirion lay under a warm blanket, pale and exhausted. As soon as she crossed the threshold of the room, the door behind her slammed shut with a loud and distinct bang, echoing in the spacious hall and filling the space with a short but sharp sound that momentarily disturbed the silence and peace around. Suddenly, the boy, filled with fear and pain, abruptly threw some foreign object at the woman, while loudly and desperately screaming for her to leave immediately, and the lady, feeling sudden pain and tension, winced and clenched her teeth, trying to hide her true feelings. There was a heavy and awkward pause between them. The boy, clenching his fists and breathing hard, waited for her to leave, as if afraid of further suffering, and she, stopping in place, froze, putting her hand to her face, trying to hold back her tears and maintain external calm, despite all the pain in her soul. Selfius Sultan Lafirion, with obvious surprise and bewilderment, noticed that it was not a simple servant who entered the room, but his stepmother, and with a trembling voice and anxiety in his eyes, he quietly asked what exactly she was doing here at such an inopportune moment. Beads of sweat slowly trickled down his pale face, and almost in a whisper, afraid of being heard, he said with bitterness and resentment in his voice, did he really seem so funny or ridiculous to her that she decided to come here to mock and ridicule his weakness and suffering? Hiding deeper under the warm blanket, as if trying to hide from cruel eyes and cold words, he whispered quietly and almost hopelessly, begging her not to show the slightest interest in him, not to touch or disturb him, because he just wanted to be alone with his thoughts and pain. Farashati, clutching her head in her hands from excitement and anxiety, looked tiredly and worriedly at the boy, who really looked very bad, weakened and exhausted, as if all his vital energy was gradually leaving him in a state of complete exhaustion. The lovely noblewoman stood in the center of the boy's cramped and cluttered room, noticing the disorder around him. Things were scattered everywhere, as if the chaos reflected the internal struggle and confusion of Selfius himself, whose world was crumbling before everyone's eyes. Lowering herself carefully onto the edge of the bed, she quietly and with sincere sympathy explained that she had not intended to laugh or mock him at all, but on the contrary, she had come to help, to treat his wounds and ease the suffering that he had so courageously endured. But suddenly, Selfius Sultan Lafirion jumped up from his bed. His eyes sparkled with despair and fear, and, unable to bear it, he ran away, loudly shouting for her to leave immediately and not disturb him, as if her presence was an unbearable burden for him. At the most unexpected moment, he suddenly noticed that the lady herself was wounded. Scarlet drops of blood were slowly flowing down her head, leaving bright marks on her fair skin, and this discovery filled his soul with fear, causing him to freeze in horror and despair at the same time. Overcome with sudden great fear, he stood motionless, realizing that he had accidentally hurt an innocent maiden, and his wide-open eyes reflected the depth of shock and regret that was seething in his heart like an unquenchable storm of emotions. The boy trembled all over with horror, looking at the scarlet blood, which he was afraid to see even in his worst dreams, reproaching himself for what had happened, while the lady, gritting her teeth and clenching her hand on her head, tried to gather her will into a fist and hold back the unbearable pain. After what had happened, he bowed deeply before the lady and humbly asked her not to divulge to the Duke what had happened, warning that otherwise he could be severely punished and possibly expelled from the estate without the right to return. Gently and understandingly, noticing the obvious fear in the boy's eyes, she reassuringly said that Selfius Sultan Leferian need not worry. Everything was already behind her, and she would not say a word to anyone, keeping what had happened a secret and protecting him from unnecessary worries. Carefully opening the box of medicines and instruments, she began to carefully and tenderly treat the boy's wound, carefully lubricating and bandaging his arm with sterile bandages, trying to do everything possible to ease his pain and speed up healing. She was sincerely glad to see that the wound on his hand was very small and not as deep as she had feared, which gave her sincere hope for a speedy recovery and relieved her of difficult experiences. Holding the boy's hand, she quietly and gently suggested to him that if he did not want to return back to the villa, she would be ready to help him with this and try to convince the Duke to leave him here, where he would be under her protection and careful supervision. Young Selfius Sultan Leferian, lowering his head and thoughtfully looking at the floor, quietly asked himself, as if in a whisper, why the lady was showing such concern and why he needed her participation and help so much at this difficult moment in his life. Upset and with concern in his voice, as she carefully treated his wound, he timidly and slightly depressed asked if he really looked so helpless and worthless that those around him considered him incapable of anything meaningful and important in life. After that, he harshly and rudely ordered her to immediately finish the bandage and leave, repeating in a strangled voice in his soul that everyone around him seemed as if he was truly worthless and incapable of achieving anything worthy and significant in his future. Sitting opposite the young man, Farashati carefully and with sincere concern asked if the Duke himself had really spoken such rude and cold words to him, to which Selfius replied with quiet bitterness that such conversations and rumors had long been circulating everywhere, like the whispers of shadows in the castle, haunting him every day. Finally, the girl carefully and with great caution completed the bandage, gently removed her hands, ceasing to hold the boy's hand, exhausted by pain, as if letting him know that now he could relax a little and not be afraid of further touches, to feel at least a little relief. Selfius Sultan Leferian was silent, depressed, and deeply upset. His gaze seemed dull and tired, as if the whole weight of the world had fallen on his fragile shoulders, leaving his soul in the darkness of hopelessness and loneliness, from which it seemed there was no way back. Suddenly, unexpectedly, strong childish hands grabbed him by the cheeks, squeezing tightly, as if trying to keep him from falling, and then pulled him in different directions, causing the boy to feel shock and bewilderment at what was happening, as if the world around him had suddenly turned upside down, confusing and disconcerting him. Farashati loudly and decisively declared that it was thanks to her intervention and courage that she was able to drive away that vile and treacherous knight who threatened them, protecting the boy and defending justice in that difficult situation where every moment was worth its weight in gold. However, Selfius Sultan Leferian did not share her opinion and believed that the true fear in the guard's soul was not directed at him personally, but only at his father himself, whose strength and authority inspired awe and respect, causing him to fear not his son, but his powerful parent. The lady shouted rudely and loudly, demanding that the young man immediately stop belittling his merits and achievements, stop devaluing himself, and finally begin to see in himself the strength and value that he deserves, because only in this way will he be able to gain confidence and cope with all the trials. After which she added that she used to think exactly the same as he did, that he was good for nothing, but now she had completely changed her mind, realizing how much stronger he was than he seemed, and how much hidden courage and dignity he had, which he himself did not yet suspect. Sitting next to him, gently hugging the boy's cheeks, she softly said that there would be no sense or point if he continued to mutilate himself and give up, because only faith in himself and strength of spirit would help him overcome all difficulties and emerge victorious from any situation. Young Selfius Sultan Lafirion looked at her with a surprised and touched look, barely holding back tears. Red and confused, he was deeply touched by her care and kindness, which warmed his heart and gave hope for a better future. However, the girl suddenly turned away from him and firmly stated that when the Duke returned, they would definitely talk to him to convince him to let the boy stay here and not leave, because he would be better and safer here during this difficult period. She then slowly turned to the young man and carefully asked him if he was truly completely satisfied with the decision he had made, trying to understand his feelings and make sure that he felt supported and confident in this important step that they were about to take. At that moment, Selfius Sultan Lafirion extended his hand to her, carefully wiping the blood from her head, quietly saying that she was very dirty, but his voice did not sound irritated, but tender and sincerely grateful for her care and attention, despite the pain. Seeing how the boy, despite his worries, still allowed himself to be taken care of, she tried to gently reassure him that everything was okay, that he was not alone, and that together they would definitely cope with all the trials and tribulations that lay ahead. Confused and slightly confused, the lovely Selfius Sultan Lafirion asked her with genuine curiosity what good could come from her having skin torn off and blood covering her body, causing him concern and deep bewilderment. The girl, smiling joyfully and a little shyly, answered him with tenderness and light warmth, feeling an inner warmth from the fact that he had now really begun to show care and attention to her, which filled her heart with bright feelings and quiet hope. Embarrassed by his stepmother's gentle and unexpectedly warm gaze, the young man blushed deeply, awkwardly looked away, as if afraid that she would notice the timid confusion of his heart, and with trembling fingers clutched the edge of the blanket, trying to completely hide his embarrassment. Plucking up his courage, and still feeling his cheeks flush hotly, the boy quietly asked if the noble lady really did not know that a dangerous poison flowed through his veins, capable of injuring anyone who inattentively touched his blood. Farashati, smiling softly and looking straight into the confused eyes of her companion, confidently assured him that everything would be fine with her body, and even an accidental drop of his poisonous blood would not harm her, because this insidious poison did not have a special effect on her. Taking the boy's warm palm into her own, she immediately noticed that the tips of his fingers were scratched and studded with tiny wounds, as if the young owner of the room was desperately squeezing an invisible blade, trying to hide the pain and shameful tears from prying eyes. But before the beauty had time to take the healing ointment out of the first aid kit, a sharp pulsation roared in her temples, and a scarlet stream suddenly burst from her nostril, burned her lips with a metallic taste, and dripped onto the snow-white bandages, loudly proclaiming her weakening strength. The young man, shocked by the weakness of his savior, was frozen with horror, but, stepping over his own pain, he rushed forward and caught her falling body before it touched the cold floor, and in his eyes a desperate, touching concern sparkled, almost to tears. The noblewoman suddenly remembered, with an unexpected shudder, how just a moment ago the young boy had touched her forehead with his hand, and at that very moment it dawned on her with terrifying clarity that his blood, possessing destructive power, had penetrated through the open wound. Her eyes widened sharply and noticeably in silent horror, as if a deep abyss had suddenly opened up before her, because the realization that poisonous blood was now pulsating in her body seemed to tighten around her chest like a chain, causing trembling and barely restrained great fear. Selfius Sultan Lafirion, noticing how pale and weak his patroness had become, asked with deep concern and anxiety what exactly had happened to the lady, while she, wheezing from lack of air and painful tension, tried with all her might to calm the young man and hide her own vulnerability. And Farashati, feeling that the world around her was dangerously spinning and clouding her consciousness, with all her might clenched her fists until they hurt, trying to stay on her feet so as not to frighten her charge, while hot blood relentlessly oozed from her nose, reminding her of the fragility and mortality of human flesh. However, her inner stubbornness and willpower were powerless against her growing weakness. Her strength suddenly left her, and like a tender doll broken in the hands of fate, she fell unconscious at the feet of the young man, her body silently sliding across the cold marble. Selfius Sultan Lefirian, a man accustomed to enduring any trials with dignity, suddenly froze in complete shock, as if chained, his youthful eyes filled with horror. His breathing became intermittent and ragged, and thoughts, like frightened birds, darted around in his head. The girl stood alone in the darkness, her dress rustling softly and swaying slightly in the dim light, creating an atmosphere of mystery and vulnerability, as if she were a ghost lost in the silence of the night and the search for meaning that torments her tender soul. Waking up in her luxurious bed with silk curtains, the noblewoman found the duke, son, and advisor next to her, quietly and attentively watching her, as if waiting for the first signs of her awakening, ready to support and protect her at any unforeseen moment. Blinking, the beauty gradually came to her senses, looking around with growing interest and slight anxiety, her consciousness slowly returning from the depths of sleep, filling the space around her with warm light, hope, and a premonition of new trials for the coming day. Her husband, bowing his head with gentle concern and a slight worry in his voice, gently asked how she was feeling after her night's rest, wanting to make sure she was well and ready to face the new day together, strengthening their bond and understanding. She herself clearly remembered and distinctly saw in her mind the disfigured and distorted face of the young man, who screamed desperately and shouted loudly when she suddenly fell, plunging everyone present into deep anxiety and hopeless fear for her life, as if time had frozen for a moment. She was well aware and understood that she had been poisoned by a deadly poison that had entered her blood through the young master, and she realized with horror that this poison was extremely strong, insidious, and merciless, capable of slowly destroying health, depriving the body of vitality without the slightest mercy. Tired and weakened, leaning on her weak arm, Farashati shuddered with relief, feeling that she was still alive, and this short, but such an important moment of awareness of salvation filled her exhausted heart with a slight hope, although her strength was still far from complete and final recovery. When suddenly, Selfius Sultan Lefirian, standing quietly and motionless behind his father, asked in a quiet but confident and penetrating voice whether the lady was really alive, and his words pierced the tense air filled with anxiety, causing everyone to freeze in oppressive anticipation of an answer. The man calmly and gently reassured the boy, assuring him that there was no need to worry, because their ward Farashati was immune to their poison, and therefore no danger posed a threat to her, which gave everyone great relief and strong hope. The noblewoman decided to intervene and spoke up, trying to calm the boy down and give him a sense of confidence, but her attempt was interrupted by harsh and powerful words, depriving her of the opportunity to convey her support and sincere compassion in this tense moment. Terdeo Dane Lefirion scolded her sternly and firmly for acting recklessly in trying to help the boy, reminding her that such a risk could have cost her her life, since the poison that entered her body was extremely dangerous and could cause irreparable harm to her health. With her head down, feeling guilty and slightly embarrassed, the woman apologized guiltily to the guy, admitting that she had indeed made a mistake and had not thought about the consequences of her actions, which made her seriously think about her responsibility and caution in the future. The uncle spoke to the boy in quiet, serious words, explaining that he now understood how poisonous and dangerous his blood was. But suddenly the man fell silent, noticing the young man's violent and unpredictable reaction, which took everyone by surprise and deeply touched them. Selfius Sultan Lefirion stood motionless, tears slowly rolling down his cheeks in large drops, and his head was lowered, as if the weight of the awareness of all the danger and responsibility fell on his young shoulders, causing him to experience the deepest pain and internal struggle. The shocked Duke stood frozen in place, watching his son with surprise and alarm, because he had never seen the boy cry before, and now he looked confused and depressed, as if the boy's inner world was collapsing before the eyes of everyone present in the room. Quietly and with pain in his voice, Selfius Sultan Lefurian whispered that he was going to return to the villa, would no longer contradict his uncle, admitting that he was completely right and realizing that he really was dangerous. And now he had to accept this hard and inevitable truth for the sake of his own future. Quietly and timidly, he apologized to the man standing in the middle of the entire room, speaking with a heavy sense of guilt and sincere remorse, after which a deep and oppressive silence ensued, which seemed to fill the entire space around, leaving not the slightest sound. After these words, Selfius Sultan Lefurian slowly wiped away his tears with the sleeve of his waistcoat, turned his back to those gathered, and without saying a word, walked away with a confident and decisive gait, leaving behind him a barely perceptible trail of sadness and hopelessness. Farashati, watching the boy leave, felt deep and sincere regret, and her face expressed warm sympathy and tenderness, as if she was trying to understand the full weight of his internal struggle and emotional pain, which he so carefully hid from everyone around him. Without thinking twice, she rose smoothly from her seat, allowing her long, golden thread-like red hair to flutter freely in the wind, creating around her an almost fairy tale atmosphere of quiet determination and inner strength, ready for the upcoming important changes in her life. The lady suddenly grabbed the young man by the shirt, holding him tightly, not allowing him to take a single step further, as if with her gesture she was trying to stop his flight and force him to stay, despite all the internal struggle and uncertainty burning in his eyes. A surprised Selfius Sultan Lefurian staggered, barely keeping his feet, when a woman's hand suddenly pulled him back, as if an invisible thread connected them, making him feel like a prisoner of his own feelings and unresolved emotions that he had tried to hide for so long. The surprised boy quickly turned around, and transparent drops slowly flowed from his red eyes, reflecting all the pain and confusion that he tried to contain, but which was now bursting out like an inexorable stream of emotions and experiences. Firmly and sternly, but with a hint of warmth in her voice, Farashati told him that everything was fine, that he could boldly tell his adoptive father whatever he wanted without fear of condemnation, because it was honesty and openness that would help them all find a path to mutual understanding and peace. The Duke, avoiding the gaze, looked away when a stern voice was heard, demanding that someone be sure to keep an eye on Selfius Sultan Lefurian if he decided to leave. Otherwise, no one would be able to control the situation and ensure safety at any time. Farashati, angry and resentful, accused the Duke of failing to teach the child how to properly control his poison, rather than placing all the blame on the boy himself, as if ignoring his suffering and the internal struggle he was forced to endure in complete solitude and oblivion. She remembered the poor boy sitting quietly at the table, wishing only to be with his family at this important moment, and not to leave them forever, feeling the cold of loneliness and disappointment piercing his young heart deeper than anyone could ever truly understand. Sharply and without a shadow of a doubt, she asked the Duke a question that sounded like an accusation. Did he really want to isolate the boy, cutting him off from his family and from life, depriving him of the opportunity to grow up as a full and happy person in the circle of close and loved ones? In complete shock and obvious bewilderment, the charming aristocrat asked what exactly she meant by claiming that he had kept the young man in captivity, as if afraid to admit his own mistakes and the consequences of his decisions, on which the fate of the poor child depended. The advisor, with restraint and wisdom, recommended that the gentleman first listen to his wife, without rushing into accusations and threats, because this was the only way to understand the true motives and feelings hidden behind her words, and not create new conflicts without reason. The woman's hand still held the boy's shirt tightly, as if not wanting to let him go, and making it clear that he was needed here, that leaving was not possible now, and that this was where he had to stay to feel the warmth and support of his family, which he had so lacked before. Young Selfius Sultan Lefurian, also in shock, listened attentively to his new stepmother, who sincerely asked his father to first listen to the boy and give him a chance to stay here, in the family, where he would be understood and supported in difficult moments of life. Suddenly, the aristocrat slowly approached the lady, leaned so close that she, seized by surprise and a slight trepidation, froze, as if in slow motion, not expecting such an unexpected and close approach, which disturbed her inner peace and quiet. In a quiet, almost whispering voice, he spoke words of concern and warning into her ear, explaining that she could not be absolutely sure that what had happened would not happen again, because it was quite possible that the event could happen again, and then her life would be in serious danger. Fertishati, overcome with fear and feeling cold sweat break out on her forehead, replied, looking with alarm and genuine concern, that even the Duke was a danger to her, and therefore she intended to be extremely careful, trying to avoid any consequences that could harm her. Suddenly, unexpectedly for everyone, the Duke's son, gathering all the courage in his soul and feeling the weight of the moment, slowly and confidently raised his voice, addressing his adoptive father, trying to convey his sincere feelings and an important message, full of hope and determination. The boy, trembling with excitement and internal struggle, extended his hand forward, as if offering a symbolic gesture of reconciliation and trust, expressing a desire to be heard and accepted, trying to show that he was ready to compromise for the sake of the future and peace in the house. Then the boy stood before his stepmother with a proud and firm expression on his face. His voice sounded decisive and confident as he declared that he really wanted to stay in this house forever, to become part of the family, and live here despite all the difficulties and trials of fate. The fear and anxiety hidden behind the steadfastness could be read on the young man's face, but he sincerely promised that he would use all his strength and all his will to learn to control the dangerous power of his poison, without causing harm to his loved ones and keeping himself in harmony. The Duke stood for a moment in silence, his head bowed, deeply focused on every word his son said, trying to understand the meaning of what was said, experiencing a storm of conflicting emotions in his soul, anxiety and hope, which fought for supremacy in his heart. The nobleman's hand, trembling with excitement and anxiety, rose nervously as he addressed the boy with a caring question, asking if there was anything important he needed to take from his things located in the country estate, so that everything would be prepared for his comfortable stay here. At first, the boy did not immediately understand what exactly the Duke was talking about. His face expressed slight confusion, but then, realizing the true meaning of the words, he was sincerely happy, because now he was allowed to stay, and this decision filled his heart with joy and relief. Terdeo Dane Lafirian, noticing the change in mood, spoke seriously, warning that the boy must be extremely careful and cautious so that no outsider would ever learn of the existence and true strength of his poison, which could lead to irreparable consequences. After a short thought, the Duke raised his imperious palm and, turning to his devoted advisor, solemnly ordered that spacious apartments be urgently arranged for the young and sweet Selfius, so that he would feel welcome in their home and quickly forget his worries. The aristocrat's assistant, beaming with a welcoming smile, quietly called the young gentleman to him and informed him that they would have to immediately go to the capital's master tailor in order to create a new wardrobe of luxurious fabrics for the heir. Soon, exchanging a last glance, they slowly left their chambers, and their light steps died away in the distant corridor, where silence reigned, colored by the rustling of carpets, the aroma of candles, and the coolness of the night air that penetrated through the half-open windows. Ferishati, allowing a warm and gentle smile to blossom on her face, watched in delight as the happy child disappeared through the door, and behind her, like an invisible support, stood her husband, the Duke, attentively listening to every breath and sharing the joy of the moment. Suddenly, breaking the tense silence that hung in the room, Terdeo Dane Lafirian spoke with cold restraint, fixing his gaze on his wife, and asked why she was so unusually interested in making that boy truly happy. Lady Ferishati slowly raised her head, her eyes dimming for a moment from the thoughts and mental pain that flooded her, and she silently considered a possible answer, as if memories were struggling inside her, that she did not want to disturb, but could no longer hide. After a short pause, she looked away towards the window, sighed with quiet sadness, and muttered barely audibly that she had simply suddenly remembered her youth, her loneliness, and the pain she had experienced as a child, and therefore could not help but feel compassion for the poor child. Selfius Sultan Lafirian looked truly happy. His eyes were shining with joy. There was a slight blush on his cheeks, and he smiled sincerely, like a child who was given something dear to his heart for the first time: warmth, acceptance, and real care. Farashati looked down at her graceful, almost transparent palm, remembering how just recently a scarlet trace of the poisonous blood of the ducal family had been imprinted on it, and with inexpressible horror, she realized that only one step separated her from death, which could be painful. A cold, sudden fear gripped her shoulders, and holding her breath, the lady realized that death could overtake her suddenly, like a shadow without warning, because the boy's poison was strong, and one accidental touch would be enough to cut short her fragile and small life. The huge old mansion seemed gloomier than usual when the evening sky was covered with heavy clouds, thickening the gray haze over the earth, and it seemed as if the building itself was holding its breath in anticipation of something alarming and inevitable. Several long and difficult days had already passed, and Farashati was sitting quietly in her office, having a detailed and important conversation with a wise advisor, when suddenly her thoughts and speech were interrupted by someone's voice, penetrating the silence like a warm wind and causing her to shudder slightly. From the very early morning, two unexpected and long familiar guests came to her unexpectedly. Two girls with unusual bright blue hair, whose appearance was a surprise for her, but at the same time an intriguing sign after the recent disturbing events with the boy. After all the terrible things that happened to the boy, Farashati made every effort to get used to and adapt to this new home as quickly as possible, and she finally had her own cozy workplace where she could collect her thoughts and make further plans. Unfortunately, not all of the Duke's family greeted her arrival with genuine joy and warmth. When they first met, the atmosphere was filled with tension, mistrust, and caution, which became more and more noticeable with each subsequent meeting, darkening the relationship. The nobles looked at her with obvious discontent and wariness, attentively and coldly, not allowing themselves the slightest smile, as if every step she took and every word she spoke caused doubts and hidden internal resistance in them, creating a tense and gloomy atmosphere in the hall. The new Duchess, despite the anxiety and overwhelming fear raging within her, showed incredible willpower, carefully restraining her emotions in order to remain calm, keep her face, and not show the slightest desire to leave this difficult and alien environment. In many ways, she was helped by her husband's wise and noble advisor, who patiently instructed and supported her, helping her to build the right relationships and find a common language with other family members and the nobility, easing her position in the new home. The old counselor was no stranger to Farashati's fate, and his concern that the Duchess should not be in danger or die again was genuine, for he understood how fragile her situation was and how important her safety and well-being were to everyone. Standing among endless rows of ancient books in the spacious library, the nobles animatedly discussed the latest events, sharing rumors and guesses, absorbing every word with interest, as if every new piece of news could radically change the course of their lives and the fate of the house. The first and most important thing for the lady was that she learned that the estate, located in the capital, and for a long time the envy of the neighbors, had finally passed into the possession of her husband's family. And all this happened by the will of the Duke himself, which meant new opportunities and inevitable trials. The eldest son of the advisor was responsible for the management of the house in the capital, who supervised all affairs with great responsibility and diligence, acting as a Grand Duke, conducting negotiations and resolving issues through numerous letters, maintaining order in the power of his family. The relationship between the aristocrat and the empire was complex and ambiguous, and did not amount to simple hostile confrontation or unconditional friendship. Rather, it was a subtle diplomatic game in which mutual recriminations and cautious respect were intertwined. The second important fact was that none of the numerous servants and the immediate circle of the family were aware of the terrible curse that was hidden in the history of the owners of their estate, and this knowledge was kept as a carefully hidden secret, accessible only to a few. Only one person knew the truth about the curse: Moulton, who had served the Duke's family with devotion and loyalty for many years, guarding secrets and protecting the family from unnecessary worries, understanding the full responsibility placed on him by fate. Recently, the youngest daughter of the great Moulton family entered the knightly order of the Duke with pride and determination, which became an important event for the entire family, filling the hearts of their loved ones with pride and hope for the continuation of valiant traditions and glorious deeds. As the elder spoke of his daughter's achievements, his face lit up with happiness and satisfaction, reflecting the depth of his pride that his descendant had been able to achieve such a high and honorable position in the knightly order, proving her strength and devotion. The third fact, no less significant, was that her husband, in his position of power and responsibility, had ordered that blood be taken from the young knight for testing in order to understand why the curse of poison, which usually affected all of the family, had no power over her and did not cause harm. The lady, not fully understanding the reasons for her unusual immunity to the poison, nevertheless showed wisdom and prudence in allowing the doctor to carry out all the necessary medical procedures and examinations to determine the reasons for her resistance and protect the future of the family. The quiet, even tick of the antique clock on the wooden table monotonously counted off the endless minutes, as if reminding us of the inexorable and merciless flow of time, which slowly but surely carried all events into the distant past, leaving behind only memories and the quiet rustle of yellowed pages. The lady felt deep satisfaction and great peace, lying on a soft sofa in a spacious estate, enjoying the long-awaited rest and peace that she so rarely managed to find in the hustle and bustle of everyday worries and various duties. Interesting books and important documents were neatly scattered on the table, which testified to constant employment and a desire for knowledge, as well as continuous work that required attention and concentration, even in moments of rest. Farashati was truly passionate about learning and discovering new things, so she regularly visited the rich library of the estate, where she immersed herself in reading with trepidation and attention, discovering the endless expanses of knowledge and wisdom that inspired her. She deeply and sincerely hoped that, having acquired the necessary knowledge and valuable experience, when she left her husband under contract, she would be able to successfully manage the vast lands that she inherited from her father, the Count, and justify the expectations and hopes of her family placed on her. Suddenly, when the conversation with the advisor was in full swing, a soft but insistent voice interrupted their long conversation, informing that unexpected guests had come to the lady, and now the time for discussions would have to be postponed until a more convenient moment. The lady slowly sat down on the sofa, and opposite her appeared two noblewomen in mustard dresses, who brought with them respectable guests, after which they left the room, hiding behind the door and not expressing the slightest interest in further communication. The former stepmother, and next to her, her half-sister, who had once betrayed her and doomed her to a bitter death in her previous reincarnation, now sat decorously opposite the young lady at a carved tea table, measuredly sipping a fragrant jasmine infusion. Farashati, hiding the unbearable storm of memories in the depths of her soul, sat with her face slightly turned away and her gaze fixed on the pattern of the silk tablecloth, because if she only lowered her eyes to the traitors, unnecessary and dangerous suspicions would immediately arise. In the midst of the silent confrontation, a thin-walled porcelain cup sat on the polished table, from the neck of which a smooth, transparent swirl of fragrant jasmine steam slowly rose, like a ghostly curtain gracefully separating old enemies. It was during that dark time that she cast a fatal stain on the reputation of her former family, when, driven by rage and wounded pride, she mercilessly ordered her former lover to disappear beyond the gates of the estate, severing all ties with him forever. The lady, pierced by 1,000 memories and holding back the tension in her voice, tried to maintain a proud posture when she calmly, but with icy detachment, asked the question, why, after such a long and painful silence, did they decide to appear again? and what reason made them cross the threshold of this house. The noblewoman, whose face had grown pale in the shadow of past shame, shuddered all over and shifted uncomfortably in her chair, when the other girl, whose excitement could not be concealed, set a porcelain cup down on the table with a sharp clink, breaking the fragile and anxious silence in the room. Quite unexpectedly, as if under the pressure of memories, the old stepmother burst into tears, stumbling over her words. In a trembling voice, she began to beg her adopted daughter to forgive her for those terrible actions, for running away, for indifference, and for the years of lost love. She began to complain bitterly and sigh sadly, as if trying to justify herself and find an excuse, saying that, apparently, she had paid too little attention to Farashati since she had once decided to run away from her, pressing her hands tightly to her chest, as if protecting her broken heart. The woman, covering her face with her hands, lowered her head and slumped heavily, sobbing from pain and sincere remorse, admitting out loud that she had not even bothered to congratulate the lady on her wedding properly, thereby missing an important and touching moment of reconciliation and warmth. Farashati did not expect to hear these belated and dubious apologies from her stepmother, because deep in her soul, she had already let go of all hope for sincerity, understanding, and support, knowing that old wounds cannot be healed with empty words and regrets. She clenched her fist in front of her, trying to contain the wave of emotion and anger as she looked at the woman, trying painfully to understand whether she was truly repentant, or if this was all just a carefully staged performance designed to deceive and hurt again. When the lady suddenly rose from her seat, the stepmother, completely unable to react, stretched out her hand forward and burned herself with hot, almost boiling tea, the drops of which burned her delicate skin, causing a sharp and unbearable pain that instantly engulfed her entire palm. The sudden and sharp pain made the noblewoman unable to hold back her tears. She began to sob, her voice trembling with fear and excruciating pain, and her youngest daughter, who was standing nearby, hurried to approach, carefully hug her, and try to gently calm her down, tenderly whispering words of comfort and support. Meanwhile, the aristocrat, slightly bowing her head with obvious concern and care in her voice, carefully asked Farashati if she had suffered from this burn, if she was okay, if she had burned herself accidentally, because such sudden incidents could lead to unpleasant and serious consequences. After that, she carefully approached her ex-daughter and quietly said that she should immediately call a doctor, carefully wipe the burnt area, and also clean up the spilled tea to prevent the formation of a painful burn and avoid further unwanted complications. This calm and caring manifestation brought back sweet and warm memories from Farashati's distant childhood, when her stepmother, at the same moments, took care of her just as tenderly and affectionately, as if she were an important thing that required careful treatment and protection from all adversity. However, the spilled tea and the unexpected situation itself still caused deep suspicion and anxiety in Farashati's soul, as if there was an elusive thing hanging in the air, a hidden tension that she could not ignore and completely let go of from her heart. The stepmother woman continued to behave kindly and caringly, as if trying to restore the previous trusting relationship, but Farashati, despite these warm words and actions, could not trust her unconditionally, remaining wary and cold. Drops of the hot drink slowly and continuously flowed down from the table, leaving wet marks on its glossy surface, as if reminding of the recent incident that had abruptly broken the fragile peace in the room and forced everyone present to hold their breath, frozen in anticipation. The aristocrat was already deeply confused and did not know who to trust at this difficult moment, doubting not only those around her, but also her own sanity, as if an inner voice was treacherously whispering to her about possible danger and hidden betrayal. Sweat slowly and in drops flowed down her face. Her lips were tightly pressed, reflecting all the uncertainty and excruciating fear that was hidden deep in her soul, and revealed the true feelings that she tried her best to hide from prying eyes. But they were too obvious and clear. One of the maids at this time, not paying much attention to what was happening, methodically wiped the window with a rag, quietly whispering with her neighbors and discussing the long-awaited arrival of the Duchess's new family, as if trying to distract herself from the heavy and tense atmosphere and find at least a little long-awaited lightness. Another maid, with light hair like threads of sunlight, carefully noticed that the faces of the aristocrats looked strange, unusual, as if hiding something deep and disturbing, which immediately attracted her attention and made her think. Then the stepmother's face showed ferocity and hidden anger, clearly revealing the internal tension and storm of emotions, while her daughter smiled with icy mockery, as if she and her neighbor had come to visit not a kindred spirit, but sworn enemies, which only increased the strangeness of what was happening. As a result, the maids, carefully observing every movement and facial expression, came to the firm conclusion that the rumors were true. The Duchess really had exiled her family in order to personally control the entire inheritance, leaving no room for doubt or dispute. The maids continued to animatedly discuss their new mistress, convinced that she had selfish motives regarding the Duke's family, since she was already actively interfering in their family and political affairs, as if trying to strengthen her influence by any available means. Many among the servants and courtiers whispered that Farashati had managed to charm the noblemen with her gentle, innocent, and at the same time attractive behavior, which seemed so natural and sincere that no one could resist her charm. The maids, smiling and exchanging glances, continued to animatedly discuss their mistress, convinced of her incredible strength and cunning, because she was able not only to defeat the princess herself, but also to win the heart of a noble aristocrat, which seemed almost impossible for an ordinary girl from their circle. Suddenly, the ladies in the room froze in horror and confusion as the door swung open and a man with a stern, commanding expression entered, sternly asking what exactly they were talking about at this tense and anxious moment. It was Selfius Sultan Lafirian himself, a majestic and powerful man, who walked confidently into the room, looking intently and sternly at the maids, as if evaluating their every word and action, not allowing a drop of disobedience or frivolity. While the maids stood in awkward silence, they came here with the purpose of serving freshly brewed aromatic tea to the mistress and her dear guests, trying to fulfill their duties even in the atmosphere of tension and hidden fear that reigned around. And suddenly, the younger sister, overcoming her shyness and inner embarrassment, plucked up her courage and quietly but decisively raised her voice, asking Farashati when exactly she first met the Duke, causing a slight tension in the air and attracting the attention of everyone present in the room. The stepmother, nervously running her fingers over her daughter's dress, tried to convince everyone that the main thing in this story was not at all what they were talking about, but something completely different, much more important and significant, requiring attention and understanding. The woman skillfully turned the conversation to another plane, declaring that sinister and malicious rumors were spreading in high society that she had driven away her own family only in order to take sole possession of all their rich property and leave nothing for her heirs. Farashati sat motionless, listening to her ex-mother's speech, who assured that she did not share such suspicions, but these dark rumors still caused her anxiety and wariness, forcing her to doubt the true motives of what was happening. After this, Mother began to talk about how the Duke was apparently extremely strict and demanding of her, since he forbade the entire family to meet with her more often than allowed, which only exacerbated the tension and alienation between them. After these words, she smiled a soft but slightly mocking smile and said that in order to observe noble customs and traditions, every nobleman at least had to pay tribute to the one he took as a wife, showing respect and care, as required by all the rules. The noblewoman, continuing to listen attentively and watch her stepmother, gradually began to understand that behind this polite speech there was a simple and selfish desire to get more money, power, or some material benefits from her, which caused her to become increasingly suspicious and distrustful. Her sister, smiling slightly and trying to sound convincing, began to justify herself and explain that the city had become too crowded and noisy, so it would be better if they stayed to live with their uncle, because that way they would not bother anyone and would create fewer problems for everyone around them. The noblewoman sat motionless, as if rooted in her chair, still silent, clutching her hand to her chest, as if holding back a storm of feelings and memories that were increasingly taking hold of her heart and mind at this difficult, tense, and painful moment. The relative, as if not noticing that the lady had become worse and that it was becoming increasingly difficult for her to listen, continued to speak with the naive confidence that her former lover was still passionately in love with her and could not forget her, despite all the circumstances and the time that had passed. Suddenly, a wonderful, soulful voice crept into the room, and at the same moment a man entered, interrupting their conversation and causing everyone to instantly turn their close attention to him, as if the air around them had changed in an instant, filling with tension and anticipation. All the noblewomen suddenly shuddered and simultaneously turned sharply towards the unexpected voice, as if not expecting such a sudden intervention, their eyes filled with anxiety and surprise, reflecting all the tension of the moment, as if time slowed down around them. Farashati let out a quiet sigh of relief and carefully stepped back towards the massive door, watching the proceedings with wary attention, as if preparing for any developments that might follow this sudden appearance. It was Selfius Sultan Leferian, a boy with a stern and sullen expression on his face, who looked sternly and unfriendly at the guests, as if immediately making it clear that he did not intend to tolerate any disobedience or unnecessary talk here, ready for any development of the situation. The guests in the hall immediately rose from their chairs, deeply honoring the boy with an elegant bow, demonstrating their respect and understanding of the importance of the moment, realizing that his appearance could radically affect the course of the conversation and change the course of future events. The boy, with a shadow of malice in his voice and coldness in his eyes, said sharply and accusatorily that it seemed to him that they had come here solely for the sake of self-interest, for the Duchess's money and the intention of undermining the authority of the Duke himself, which caused discontent and suspicion. The beautiful lady's younger sister shuddered and seemed to reveal the truth that everyone had been trying to hide. Her gaze flashed with sincerity, revealing hidden emotions and inner experiences that had long been hidden behind smiles and polite words. The boy, without wasting any time, rushed to the Duchess with concern in his voice and concern in his eyes, asking if she was okay and if he was ready to help or protect her in this difficult and confusing situation, showing his devotion and determination. With a wary and worried tone in his voice, he noticed that the lady was all sweaty and looked noticeably ill, as if heavy tension and hidden worries had literally drained her strength, causing his heart to clench with anxiety for her condition and future fate. The noblewoman, in an elegant, slightly slit dress, immediately protested sharply, indignantly, declaring that they had done absolutely nothing to the Duchess and had no malicious intent, trying to defend their honor and justify their behavior in front of everyone present. The stepmother, with a caustic smile, declared that she had come here solely to visit her daughter, trying to give her meeting an innocent and harmless tone, hiding the true motives and inner feelings that lay behind these words. Selfius Sultan Leferian clearly did not believe their excuses. His gaze was cold and distrustful, and his body was tense, as if he was standing guard and was ready to protect the Duchess at any moment, defending her from any threats and betrayals lurking in this hall. Eventually, both ladies were urgently ordered to leave the room, as the condition of the lovely Farashati had worsened and her health required immediate care and attention, which forced everyone around to take urgent action and change the course of events. The ladies, having left the room, slowly walked away, leaving the aristocrat alone in silence, where she remained alone with her devoted and attentive son, who was constantly nearby, like a caring guard, ready to support her at any moment. When the great noise and bustle disappeared, the sweet girl felt how the hand pressed to her chest became lighter, and her breathing became freer and more even, as if with the departure of the noisy and tense family, the long-awaited peace and tranquility had finally reigned in her soul. A moment later, she slowly turned to the young boy, smiled tenderly, and expressed deep gratitude for his timely help, noting his care and attentiveness, which at this difficult moment turned out to be her salvation and support. The young man, blushing with embarrassment from the unexpected praise and sincere gratitude, modestly admitted that he had only overheard a casual conversation and had hurried to her out of sincere concern and care, wanting to make sure of her well-being and safety. After a short pause, like a true gentleman, he politely and courteously said that if young Farashati did not object, he would be happy to accompany her to her room to ensure her safety and give her peace of mind on the long and quiet journey home. The two of them walked slowly down the long corridor, where the subdued light softly reflected off the cold marble walls, and the velvety carpet underfoot dampened every step, creating an atmosphere of secluded and almost intimate conversation, filled with slight anxiety and anticipation. The young and lovely lady walked confidently forward on the blue carpet, lost in her thoughts, remembering that when her foster family was nearby, she suddenly began to choke, feeling a strange pressure in her chest that did not leave her even after some time. Selfius Sultan Lafirion noticed a shadow of sadness and thoughtfulness flicker across the noblewoman's face, and, trying to distract her from her gloomy thoughts, he gently asked if she knew that a grand festival was soon to take place on their estate, which promised to bring joy and change. After a short pause, keeping his voice calm and confident, he explained in detail that the festival was solemnly held in honor of the great victory of the Duke and Emperor in the recent bloody war, symbolizing the triumph and unity of their people. The beautiful Farashati listened attentively and with genuine interest to every word, while carefully placing her hand on her chest, as if trying to feel the full depth of the significance of this event, realizing the importance of the holiday for the empire and its history. Indeed, every year in the spring, the empire held a large festival dedicated to this glorious victory, and the solemn ceremony lasted a whole week, filling the streets with joy, light, and splendor, which delighted all the residents and guests of the capital. In the past, Farashati often attended festive celebrations with her beloved, and these priceless moments filled her heart with true happiness and bright dreams of a wonderful future, where joy and love would always be there, warming her soul in the darkest days. Suddenly, the boy spoke again, asking a deep and moving question with a hint of incomprehension, thinking out loud why, if the war had ended long ago, the empire continued to celebrate the victory with the same pomp, as if it were still fresh, and lived in the memory of the people, not letting them go. He tried to convince young Farashati to think about the fact that during those difficult years of war, many children lost their parents, and for them, this was most likely not a reason for joy, but bitterness and sorrow that could not be forgotten or turned into a holiday. But the young man's deep and disturbing thoughts were suddenly interrupted by his stepmother, who, with a gentle smile and soft voice, addressed him with the words, "My captive," and "my baby," trying to dispel the dark clouds of doubt and fill his heart with the warmth of care and tenderness, like a warming light. The lady, with a soft and gentle smile on her lips, quietly said that she perfectly understood all the feelings that were raging in the young man's soul, his deep melancholy and anxiety, as if reading his thoughts without words, trying to comfort and encourage him, filling his heart with the light of hope and support that could ease his inner experiences. Then she easily changed the subject, asking if all the details regarding the boy's new room had already been discussed, and if suitable furniture had been selected for him to ensure his comfort and coziness in this new corner of his life. The young man thought for a moment, slightly embarrassed, and then, with a slight smile and a hint of shyness, he offered to show his new mother his quarters, hoping that she would appreciate his space and share his desire to make this home a real and warm place for both of them. Moreover, after a short pause and with a slight blush on his cheeks, he added shyly that she could very well call him by his nickname, shortening his full name if it would be more convenient for her, because he would only be glad of such a warm and friendly address that would remind him of closeness. Selfius Sultan Lafirion instantly turned red from head to toe as he uttered his shy words with genuine excitement and slight awkwardness. A scarlet blush flared up not only on his cheeks, but even his ears seemed to start to glow, betraying the full force of his feelings and inner embarrassment. Farashati, noticing the sweet reaction, with a soft, sincere smile on her lips, quietly laughed, with pleasure and warmth in her voice, promising that from now on she would certainly call him more simply and kindly, refusing any formalities so that there would not be a single cold word between them. And after these words, wanting to further emphasize her affection and care, she carefully and tenderly ran her warm palm through his soft hair, as if giving a piece of maternal tenderness, which the boy so desperately lacked in this huge, difficult world. The two of them continued walking down the long corridor, filled with soft light that streamed through the tall windows, which offered a calm view of the garden, covered in a light evening haze, as if nature itself was holding its breath in anticipation of something important and inevitable. Farashati, slowing her pace a little and looking thoughtfully out the window, plunged into deep thoughts about the upcoming festival, not noticing how her young companion leaned over slightly, as if about to say something, but still did not dare to interrupt her silence and silence. This holiday had a deep and difficult meaning for her. After all, it was on the day of its lush and noisy celebration, to the sounds of fanfares and in a crowd of smiling people, that her previous life tragically ended, leaving behind only pain, silence, and fear of memories. From the stream of heavy and deep thoughts, Farashati was suddenly pulled out by the gentle, slightly agitated voice of the boy, and, as if awakening from an obsession, she hurried after him, heading towards his chambers, along a quiet corridor illuminated by soft light. In a stern and cold voice, the emperor expressed his extreme displeasure, suspiciously asking the duke if he had dared to break his word and was ready to treacherously stab him in the back, forgetting his oath given at the throne in the presence of all witnesses. The servant quietly entered the hall, bowed respectfully, and handed the gentleman a hefty stack of letters from the persistent princess, who, despite the cold reception, did not calm down and stubbornly continued to seek the favor of the proud, unapproachable, and silent duke. Confused, with a hint of embarrassment in his voice, the advisor reported to the gentleman that the marriage, alas, did not produce the desired result. The heiress to the throne was still persistent and still wanted to see the duke as her legal spouse. To the assistant's timid remark that perhaps he should at least skim through the princess's letters, Terdeo Dane Lafirion sighed heavily and wearily responded that the content of her messages did not change. She wrote the same words, full of feigned tenderness and royal persistence. After this, the man, not hiding the fatigue in his voice, added that he would be forced to stay in the palace for an indefinite period of time, since very serious events were planned, and he would return home only after the completion of the upcoming spring festival, which gathered all the nobility of the empire. Terdeo Dane Lafirion said with a gloomy expression that the emperor wanted to nip everything in the bud and did not give him even the slightest peace, leaving no time for rest or personal reflection, as if wanting to keep him under constant control. The advisor, who was about to take his leave and leave the office, froze in indecision when his master, without raising his eyes from the papers, suddenly asked how the duchess, who remained in his family home, was doing, and whether anything alarming had happened to her recently. Clearing his throat with a little uncertainty, the servant, after a slight hesitation, politely replied that Farashati was handling all household duties with dignity and managing the household much better than was initially expected, demonstrating maturity and responsibility in every matter. The tea slowly rose in the cup and reflected the soft light of the candle, when the servant explained in detail how the duchess had recently been visited by her foster family. But, according to his observations, absolutely nothing serious, alarming, or capable of causing any concern had occurred during their visit. Moulton added, with a slight smile, that apparently everything went quite calmly and without the slightest conflict, so there is no reason to worry about the condition of the duchess, her health, or the atmosphere that reigns in her entourage at the present time. However, Terdeo Dane Lafirion sternly and decisively stated that henceforth his advisor must exercise the utmost care and caution when dealing with any visitors to the duchess, even if it was her own family, in order to avoid possible undesirable consequences and intrigues. The man paused for a moment, thinking about the question the servant had asked regarding his intentions to divorce his wife again, and his eyes briefly showed weariness and inner conflict, reflecting the weight of making such serious decisions. Suddenly, Moulton made a decisive statement that if Terdeo really wanted to appear as an honest and fair person, he should seriously consider showing more respect and tenderness to his wife, stop hiding in his office, and start spending more time with her. Indeed, Terdeo Dane Lafirion could hardly remember the last time he had truly spent precious time with his wife, pushing aside the papers as if trying to drive away the sadness and obsessive thoughts about the past that was slipping away from him. His hand reluctantly pushed the documents aside as he became alarmed at the malicious rumors that were beginning to spread through high society, like the ominous whisper of the wind, that his feelings for Farashati were cold and far from true love, which was undermining his authority and family happiness. Suddenly rising from his seat, Terdeo Dane Lafirian firmly and decisively stated that the first priority for Moulton would now be to take immediate action to stop the circulation of this offensive article in their newspaper in order to restore honor and stop further gossip. After the words of Terdeo Dane were spoken, Lafirian slowly and thoughtfully rose from his chair, leaving behind all the weight of worries and painful thoughts, and with a confident but quiet gait headed towards the exit, as if trying to get rid of the oppression of heavy thoughts that did not give him peace and rest to his soul. Before the Duke left the room, his devoted servant, full of sincere concern and deep anxiety, gently asked whether his master had suffered from painful insomnia during these long and troubled nights, expressing a desire to help and alleviate the condition of his master. Terdeo Dane Lafirian did not give a direct answer, but his silence was more eloquent than any words, and, realizing this, Moulton gently promised that he would prepare a special tea for the gentleman for the next day, which, perhaps, would help him find peace and a good night's sleep. The long and gloomy corridor of the palace estate stretched endlessly forward, devoid of even a single window, and in this oppressive semi-darkness, any glimmer of light was mercilessly hidden, creating an atmosphere of hidden silence and heavy thoughts, emphasizing the solitude of Terdeo Dane Lafirion. Terdeo Dane Lafirion walked slowly, his head down, as if the weight of fatigue and bitter thoughts literally fettered his neck, and his gaze, tired and clouded, did not see anything around, immersed in his own dark experiences and doubts. Outside the window, a storm was raging furiously. The torrential rain poured down in an endless stream, and the peals of thunder tore through the sky, creating a frightening atmosphere, as if nature itself was reflecting the confusion and anxiety that tormented the soul of Terdeo Dane Lafirian in that dark hour. Passing by a window in a long and gloomy corridor, Terdeo Dane Lafirian could not resist glancing at the dim reflection of his own figure, which rippled and played on the wet glass, as if reminding him of the depth of his inner turmoil and thoughts. It suddenly became clear to him, as if in a nightmare vision, that the rain outside the window had turned into a thick, bloody stream, like drops of scarlet blood slowly and ominously falling from the dark sky, reminding him of the terrible times and the endless sacrifices made on the battlefield of a cruel and merciless war. Suddenly, he clearly saw how an arrow, shot by a well-aimed and experienced hunter, quickly pierced the air with a dull whistle, like a symbol of sudden danger and mortal threat that always haunted those who stood on the thin line between life and death in endless and merciless battles. Memories of bloody and fierce battles, full of pain and loss, flooded him with violent force, causing his heart to clench with bitterness and regret for the losses and suffering that remained forever in his memory, like deep scars left on his soul forever. The Duke's face was stained with the thick, dark blood of his fallen enemies, the traces of which told a terrible story of brutal and uncompromising battles, courage, and an unbreakable will to live, reflecting his unwavering determination and inner strength in the most dangerous moments of his fate. The man, burying his tired and pain-filled gaze in the cold glass of the window, thought deeply, plunging into the dark depths of memories, where cruel nightmares of the past mercilessly tormented his mind, leaving not a moment of peace, like shadows that deprive him of hope for oblivion and long-awaited peace. Then, gathering the last of his strength and determination, he slowly and confidently continued his way along the gloomy and deserted corridor, where thick darkness enveloped everything around, as if absorbing light and hope, and the silence only emphasized the heaviness of his thoughts and the internal struggle that did not subside inside. Slowly raising his hand, he covered his face, feeling the coolness of the glove tightly clinging to his wrist, as if trying to hide the fatigue and deep anxiety that deeply filled his heart. At that moment, his thoughts flew far from reality and deep into painful experiences. Suddenly, his attention was attracted by a quiet noise nearby, and he realized that in one of the rooms of the palace, in the darkness, his wife was sleeping, but the trembling of her body and beads of sweat on her forehead clearly showed that her soul was suffering and felt something ominous, inspiring fear and anxiety, encompassing her entire being. She was shaking all over, covered in sticky sweat, and it was clear that an anxious and great fear had settled in her heart inside, as if dark clouds were hanging over her soul, warning of impending troubles and misfortunes that could change the course of their fate forever. Having gazed at this young girl, he quietly sat down next to her. His thoughts were filled with excitement and anxiety, because just recently he was afraid that something terrible could happen to her, and now her every movement seemed to him evidence of unspoken trouble and hidden pain. The rain continued to fall without stopping outside the window, its cold drops slowly flowing down the glass, creating a melody of sadness and sorrow, which seemed to accompany the inner state of the man, immersed in his thoughts and worries, not noticing anything around him. The man carefully lifted the girl into his arms, trying not to hurt her, and carefully headed towards a more comfortable and protected place where she would be warmer and calmer, as if his embrace was supposed to become her reliable fortress in this troubled world. After which the man carefully laid the beautiful maiden on a soft snow-white bed, as if putting all his care and tenderness into her peace, so that she could rest in safety and warmth, surrounded by comfort and silence, giving comfort and peace. Suddenly, Farashati shuddered sharply in her sleep, as if an unknown and terrible nightmare was relentlessly pursuing her, covering her soul and mind with anxiety and fear, forcing her body to tremble in a defenseless and painful struggle with an unknown horror. Her thin, trembling hand slowly rose upward, as if in a plea and a desperate request for salvation, for help that could finally free her from the terrible and persistent nightmare that mercilessly tormented her inner world and did not give her peace for a moment. In her dream, Farashati quietly sobbed and passionately begged for help, calling for an invisible force or protector who could come to her aid and save her from the unbearable and all-consuming fear that was gripping her heart and soul with an icy grip of horror and despair. Terdeo Dane Leferian, standing next to his wife and watching her torment in her sleep, was deeply upset and confused, not knowing what to do or what to do to ease her suffering, because it was painful for him to see her suffer, and he sincerely pitied her with all his heart. His hand slowly and carefully rose up, as if wanting to gently and softly calm her, giving warmth and reliable protection to remove the heaviness and coldness of fear that had gripped the beauty in her sleep, and to remind her that she was not alone in this cold and gloomy world. He tenderly and caringly placed his warm palm on her stomach, gently stroking and tenderly soothing her, as if promising that at this moment she could allow herself to completely relax and feel absolutely safe, because there was someone nearby who was protecting and guarding her. This hand became for her a living and warm promise that no one would ever dare to hurt or worry her in this dark place, and that she could now calmly plunge into a long-awaited and deep sleep, knowing that no one would disturb her and she was safe. Finally, Farashati's face became completely relaxed, as if the heavy burden of the nightmare had disappeared without a trace, giving way to the long-awaited calm and peace that enveloped her soul with a soft veil of oblivion and allowed her to find long-awaited peace after the terrible torment of the night. The Duke, quietly moving away from her bed, left her alone in the complete silence of the room, where she slept peacefully and serenely, while outside the window, the rain was still falling quietly, filling the space with the gentle sound of drops and creating a special atmosphere of solitude and deep peace. The mansion was filled with the quiet whisper of the wind, the rustling of green leaves on tall trees, and the ringing song of awakening birds, announcing the beginning of a new bright day, full of hope and fresh opportunities, when nature slowly awakens from its night slumber and prepares for the bright sunlight. The maiden continued to happily doze on the soft bed, when suddenly she felt a strange and disturbing feeling, as if something invisible was disturbing her peace, awakening her from a pleasant dream and forcing her to be alert in complete ignorance of what was happening around her in the silence. Jumping up abruptly, she realized with surprise that she was not sleeping on the usual sofa at all, but was comfortably settled on a soft bed, surrounded by silence and semi-darkness, and at that moment she was overcome with deep bewilderment, because she had not the slightest idea who could have secretly moved her here. Clearly remembering how she had fallen asleep at her desk while working, fatigue overcoming her body and mind, she tried to understand how she had ended up in such an unexpected place, as if an invisible hand had transported her from the hustle and bustle of everyday life to this quiet room, which provided temporary refuge from worries and anxieties and noise. Slowly and carefully, the girl turned around, and to her deepest surprise, her husband was standing behind her, as if he had appeared out of nowhere, which made her wonder how he had managed to suddenly appear here at this very moment without any warning or explanation. From the loud, sharp, and unexpected cry that resounded throughout the room, the birds sitting on the branches outside the window took off in fear, flapping their wings, and quickly flew away in different directions, disturbing the silence and peace that reigned in this secluded corner of the house for the last few minutes. Half asleep and not yet fully awake, Farashadi walked slowly down the long corridor, accompanied by her husband, who followed her quietly, as if trying not to disturb her morning awakening and not to disturb the peace that reigned in the house in the first hours of a new day. At the far end of the corridor stood a spacious table set for breakfast, decorated with a variety of desserts and fresh dishes that tempted with aromas and promised a rich and enjoyable meal for the entire Duke's family, gathered together for this important moment of fellowship and unity. The Duke's entire family, feeling the warmth and comfort of the home, sat at the table, trying to enjoy the meal, paying attention to every bite of food, as if trying to satisfy not only the hunger of the body, but also to fill the souls with communication and mutual understanding in the silence of their family morning. Herself, sitting at the table and observing those around her, could not fully understand why the Duke did not share the night vigil with her in their common bed, but preferred to step aside and doze on the soft sofa, which caused her slight anxiety and secret doubts about his feelings and intentions. During this anxious and tense time, the son of an aristocrat, looking with horror at the carrots, which he madly hated to eat, barely restrained his disgust and reluctance to touch this simple, but for him unpleasant food, as if it were a symbol of his limitations and deprivations. Suddenly, Terdeo Dene Lefirion, with a thoughtful and determined expression on his face, spoke to his protege, openly expressing his thoughts and intentions that he was going to send him to study at a prestigious academy, hoping to thereby change the destiny and expand the horizons of the young man's future. The young man was filled with happiness and hope when he learned that his dream could become a reality, to enter the academy and not remain homeschooled, which seemed to him limiting and boring, because in the heart of the young spirit, a spark of desire for new knowledge and discoveries was lit. The boy, with determination and sincerity, asked for permission to go there to study, expressing his desire despite the displeasure and skepticism of his father, who, being a man of strict rules and traditions, did not approve of this idea, considering it too risky and unusual for their family and status. It is quite possible that it was the Duke's wise and experienced assistant who was able to convince him to let the boy go to school, gently but persistently explaining the importance of broadening his horizons and raising a true heir who could worthily continue the family business and glorify the name of the family. Here the boy, full of curiosity and bewilderment, asked with alarm in his voice why his relative had suddenly allowed him to go and study at the academy, although he had previously categorically forbidden it, setting restrictions that seemed unshakable and strict to him. The man calmly and judiciously explained that, despite his previous strict views and doubts, he still adhered to his opinion. But the time had come when the boy should not only study science, but also begin to socialize, learn to communicate with different people. Doubts tormented the boy, and, whispering dejectedly, he quietly said what would happen if he suddenly harmed someone again, fearing the consequences of his unbridled emotions and the possible danger emanating from his own indomitable strength. His father's assistant hastened to calm the boy down with gentle words, explaining that for such situations, it is enough to always carry a means to stop the bleeding, and then everything will be under control, ensuring the safety of both the boy himself and those around him, relieving anxiety and fear. Then he added with a slight smile that the young man should not forget. When he gets angry, he does not immediately grab his sword and does not rush at others, and this restraint gives him a feeling of pride and peace, because control over oneself is the most important quality of a true heir. In the end, the Duke, having weighed all the circumstances and internal doubts, finally made a firm decision to send his ward to the academy, which sincerely pleased the boy, giving him hope for a better future and new opportunities for development. Selfius, Sultan Lefurian, filled with joy and inspiration, solemnly promised to study hard and behave with dignity, observing all the rules and requirements in order to justify the Duke's trust and become a true example for his family and environment. Overcoming all difficulties with determination, the noblewoman smiled happily, watching the boy who was leaving the room joyful and bright, and this made her feel warmer and more pleasant in her soul, as if at that moment an atmosphere of hope and calm hung around. The Duke continued to sit with a gloomy and sad face, without any emotions, as if nothing had changed or happened inside him. Despite all the events and the joy of those around him, he remained immersed in his heavy thoughts and experiences. After this, the noblewoman quietly left the room and went to her quiet room, where other ladies were already waiting to spend the evening together in an interesting and lively conversation, filled with intrigue, secrets, and secular conversations that could lift the mood and distract from heavy thoughts.